There is a version of Charles that the world was given. It arrived in press releases and carefully timed photographs and the particular language of palace communications, which is a language designed above all else to produce a specific impression while revealing as little as possible about the reality underneath the impression. It arrived in the accounts of courtiers who had spent careers learning that loyalty to the institution meant loyalty to the narrative the institution had chosen for itself. It arrived in the sympathetic profiles and the architectural documentaries and the environmental speeches and the image of a sensitive, misunderstood man who had been failed by a fairy tale he never wanted and who deserved in the end to be understood on his own terms. The world largely accepted this version, not because it was convincing in every detail. Some of the details required considerable goodwill to accept, but because the alternative, looking directly at what the staff knew, what the courtiers knew, what the people who had served him and worked alongside him and received the full force of his personality without the management that public appearances required, was a picture that the official version had spent decades and considerable institutional resource ensuring the world would never have to see clearly. This is the story of what was buried. Not rumors, not the speculation of people with axes to grind or grievances to perform, the testimony of people who were there, who served in his households, who managed his correspondence and attended his private engagements and stood in rooms where the cameras were not present, and Charles, Prince of Wales, was simply himself without the performance that public life required. What they saw was not the sensitive, misunderstood man of the sympathetic profiles. What they saw was something that Clarence House worked very hard to ensure you would never hear about. You are about to hear about it. Every institution builds a myth about its most important members. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is not a room full of people deciding to deceive the public with deliberate malice. It is something more organic and more pervasive than that. It is the accumulated effect of thousands of individual decisions made at every level of an institution about what information is shared and what is managed, what is emphasized and what is quietly set aside, what version of a person serves the institution's purposes and what version would damage them. The myth of Charles was built over decades. It was built from specific materials. His genuine intellectual interests, which were real and in some cases serious, his environmental advocacy, which preceded public fashion on the subject by years and which came from a place of conviction that was not manufactured for effect, his architecture campaigns, controversial in their specific prescriptions but rooted in a genuine and defensible philosophy about the relationship between built environment and human well-being, his organic farming at Highgrove, his Duchy of Cornwall initiatives, his Prince's Trust, which had genuine impact on the lives of young people who benefited from it, and which represented a real commitment sustained over real time. These were not fabrications, they were real things, and the myth was built on them in the way that myths are always built on real things, by selecting the real things that serve the narrative, and placing them in a light that obscures the things that do not. What did not serve the narrative was buried. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing our channel and push the bell icon so you get all the updates about our channel. Private conversations of those who served him and who have, over the years, shared fragments of what they saw in the careful, hedged, legally cautious language of people who understand what they risk. Still there in the accounts that have emerged not through dramatic exposure but through the slow accretion of testimony that institutional pressure could manage but not entirely suppress. The picture those fragments assemble is different from the official portrait. It is the picture of a man who could be in private, something that the public version of his story required to be invisible. It is the picture of a man whose temper was not the gentle frustration of an artist misunderstood, whose treatment of the people around him was not the benign eccentricity of someone too sensitive for the modern world, whose rages, and they were rages, the staff used that word, not the euphemisms that palace language preferred but the accurate word for what they had witnessed, were something that the people on the receiving end of them carried for years afterward. It is the picture of a man who had been told, from the moment of his birth, that he was the most important person in every room he entered, and who had spent his life behaving accordingly, not in the obvious ways, not in the ways that produce the dramatic headlines of visible cruelty, in the ways that power expresses itself when it has been so thoroughly internalized that it no longer requires conscious exercise, when it is simply the air a person breathes and the assumption from which every interaction proceeds. The staff called it different things at different times in different conversations. They were careful with their language because they had reason to be careful. But the careful language, assembled from its various sources, pointed in the same direction, with a consistency that made the direction unmistakable. He could be, they said, very difficult. He could be, they said, something worse than difficult. And Clarence House, and before it St. James's Palace, and before that the various offices and communications teams and loyal courtiers who had been managing the public version of Charles for half a century, had worked very hard to ensure that the word that followed difficult never reached the people who would have found it significant. This is the story of that word, and of the people who experienced it. There is a specific experience that people who have witnessed the anger of someone with absolute authority describe in consistent terms regardless of the circumstances and the individual and the specific content of the event. They do not describe it as frightening in the simple physical sense. They describe it as destabilizing, as an experience that removes the ground from underneath you not through violence but through the sudden and complete demonstration that the normal rules of human interaction do not apply. That the person in front of you is operating in a register where ordinary social accountability has been suspended and where the suspension is so total and so unremarkable to the person exercising it that they do not even notice that anything unusual is happening. Charles's rages were described in these terms by multiple members of staff across multiple decades of his public life. They were not rare. This is the first thing that requires establishing because the myth had managed to make them seem, when they were referred to at all, like exceptional events, isolated departures from a general norm of sensitive restraint, the occasional outburst of a passionate man under enormous pressure, understandable, forgivable, not representative. They were not exceptional, they were not isolated. They were, by the accounts of those who served him over extended periods, a regular feature of the private Charles in a way that the public Charles gave no indication of and that the palace machinery worked consistently to ensure remained private. What provoked them was not by any ordinary measure proportionate to the response they produced. A former equerry who served Charles in the 1980s described an incident involving a pen, not a significant pen, not a pen with ceremonial importance or personal history, a pen of the kind that appears on desks and signing tables at official functions, the kind that exists in quantities in palace offices and that is replaced without ceremony when it runs out or is mislaid. The pen in question did not work. Charles picked it up to sign something. The pen did not produce ink, and what followed was described by the equerry with the careful precision of someone who has replayed the memory many times and has had many years to choose the words for it. He said that Charles threw the pen. He said he threw it with a force and a direction that was not accidental. He said that the throwing was accompanied by language that the equerry did not reproduce verbatim but characterized as extensive and specific in its expression of displeasure. He said that the displeasure was directed not only at the pen but at the people in the room, at the system that had allowed a non-functioning pen to be placed within his reach, at the general failure of the world to organize itself around his requirements with sufficient reliability. He said it lasted approximately 4 minutes. He said 4 minutes of that register, in a room that contained people who were professionally required to stand and receive it, felt considerably longer than 4 minutes. He said afterward Charles continued as if nothing had happened. This was, the equerry said, the part he found most difficult to process, the return to normality, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that something unusual had occurred. The resumption of ordinary interaction with the people who had just witnessed or received what had just happened, as if the preceding 4 minutes were simply a weather event that had passed and left no mark worth noting. A pen, 4 minutes, no acknowledgement. This incident is not unique. It is representative. The specific objects and occasions varied. The essential structure did not. Something did not meet the standard Charles required. The standard was absolute, and its non-meeting produced a response that bore no relationship to the scale of the failure. The response was received by the people present without the option of anything other than professional absorption. And then it was over and the world continued and Charles moved on and the people who had absorbed it took what they were carrying home with them and managed it privately and came back the next morning. A former valet described the mornings. Charles's mornings were managed by his personal staff with a precision that was, in its requirements, among the most demanding aspects of working in close personal service to him. The physical environment of his morning had to be arranged in ways that were specific and consistent and that the staff who managed them knew by heart because knowing them was the difference between a morning that proceeded correctly and a morning that did not. The toothpaste on the toothbrush. This has been reported before and it has been reported in a way that invites the dismissive response, that presents it as eccentricity rather than as what it was, which was the visible surface of a much larger pattern. The toothpaste was applied to the brush by his valet in a specific way and a specific quantity, and if the application deviated from the required specification, the deviation was addressed, not gently, not with the humor of someone who acknowledges that this is an unusual thing to be particular about, with the seriousness of someone for whom the deviation was a failure with real meaning, a representation of the larger failure of the people around him to maintain the standard his world required. The temperature of rooms, the arrangement of furniture, the placement of objects on his desk, which had an established geography that was maintained by the staff as a professional obligation, and the disturbance of which, however minor, produced a response that was disproportionate in ways that the staff had learned to anticipate, and that they could not, however much experience they accumulated, make entirely routine to receive. A former member of the Highgrove household described the experience of moving an item on the desk, not removing it, moving it a few inches in a direction that seemed from the outside inconsequential. The item was moved in the course of dusting, a routine task performed in the routine way, and was replaced in what the staff member understood to be approximately its original position. Approximately was not sufficient. She described Charles entering the room, going to the desk and stopping. She described the quality of the stop, not the stop of someone noticing something unexpected, the stop of someone confirming something expected. As if the deviation from the required arrangement was something he had anticipated, as if the world's failure to maintain the standard was so consistent that he arrived at each room already carrying the knowledge that something would be wrong, and was simply identifying the specific form the wrongness had taken today. He did not raise his voice immediately. This was something multiple staff members noted about Charles's anger. It did not always arrive at volume. Sometimes it arrived as something quieter and, in the view of those who had experienced both registers, more difficult. A cold and specific and entirely focused attention on the failure that had occurred and on the person responsible for it, that was communicated without shouting and that was for that reason harder to absorb than shouting would have been. He looked at the object, he looked at her. He said something about the arrangement that was precise and technical, and that communicated without any ambiguity that what had occurred was not a minor domestic matter, but a failure of the standard of care he required and was entitled to require, and that the failure was attributable to her, and that her responsibility for the failure was a fact he intended to establish clearly. She said yes, sir, and corrected the placement. She straightened, she continued with the dusting, she performed the professional absorption that the job required. She described going home that evening and sitting in her kitchen for a long time before she was able to make dinner, not because the incident had been dramatic, because it had been so entirely normal on his side, because he had experienced it as simply the identification and correction of an error, a routine matter of standard maintenance, and had moved on with the completeness of someone for whom that kind of interaction produced no residue, while she had been carrying what it felt like to be looked at in that way by that person in that room, and to have had no option but to absorb it and continue. The residue, she said, was always hers, never his. Charles wrote letters. This is one of the most extensively documented facts about him, and it has been presented, in the official narrative, as evidence of his engagement, his passion, his refusal to be the merely ceremonial figure that the constitutional role required, and his insistence on using the access his position provided to advocate for the causes he believed in. The letters to ministers, the famous black spider memos, named for the handwriting that sprawled across official correspondence, with the intensity of someone who was writing not because writing was the appropriate channel, but because the appropriate channels had not produced the outcomes he required, and he was going to find a channel that would. These letters became a matter of public record only after a decade of legal proceedings, the Freedom of Information requests, the Supreme Court judgments, the years of institutional resistance that finally ended in their release. The resistance itself was revealing. The Attorney General's office had argued against their release on the grounds that they could undermine the political neutrality of the monarchy by revealing the Prince of Wales advocating on political matters in his communications with government ministers, which was exactly what they revealed. The letters covered homeopathic medicine and the alleged suppression of its potential by the medical establishment. They covered badger culling and bovine tuberculosis and the agricultural policies of successive governments. They covered the deployment of British troops and the strategic situation in various theatres of military engagement. They covered building regulations and the planning system and architectural standards and the specific developments that Charles found aesthetically offensive and which he believed should be stopped. They were not the letters of someone operating within the constitutional boundaries of the British monarchy. They were the letters of someone who had decided that those boundaries did not apply to him, or who had been so thoroughly shaped by the understanding that the rules that applied to others did not apply to him, that the distinction between operating within and outside constitutional constraints had not fully registered as a distinction worth attending to. The ministers who received the letters had to navigate a specific impossibility. The correspondent was the heir to the throne. The letters were handwritten and personal, and arrived with the full weight of that position behind them. The constitutional convention that the monarch and the heir to the throne did not intervene in political matters was well established, but the convention was a convention, not a law, and conventions require the cooperation of the people they apply to in order to operate. When the person they apply to does not cooperate, the convention has no enforcement mechanism beyond the social pressure of the institution itself. Charles did not feel the social pressure, or felt it and did not find it compelling, which amounts to the same thing. The civil servants who briefed ministers on how to respond to the letters described the situation in terms that were carefully neutral and that were also, underneath the neutrality, a precise account of what it was like to have the heir to the throne writing to your minister about decisions that were constitutionally none of his business and that he was constitutionally prohibited from intervening in, and doing so with the unambiguous expectation that the intervention would produce the outcome he wanted. It sometimes did. This was the other part of the situation that the civil servants navigated with professional neutrality and private frustration. Ministers who were sensitive to the relationship with the palace, who understood that their political futures were not entirely independent of how the institution regarded them, who found in the letters not a constitutional problem but a practical reality to be managed, sometimes adjusted decisions in directions that the letters had advocated. Charles's advocacy worked often enough to be worth continuing. This was the mechanism, not conspiracy, not the dramatic corruption of democratic process through a single identifiable intervention, the slow accumulation of influence exercised through the repetition of pressure on people who had reason to respond to pressure from that source. The staff who managed the correspondence, who typed the drafts he dictated, who organized the responses, who maintained the filing systems that contained the paper trail, knew the full scope of the operation in ways that the occasional public glimpse did not convey. They knew the volume. They knew the subjects. They knew the tone of the letters that were not released because they remained outside the scope of the successful legal challenge, the ones that were more personal, more specifically targeted, more revealing in their expression of the sense of entitlement that drove the entire enterprise. One former correspondence secretary described working in that office as working in the engine room of a campaign that was not supposed to exist. Her job was to support the correspondence, to ensure it functioned efficiently, to maintain the systems that made the volume of output manageable. She performed this job with the professional competence it required. She did not agree with the constitutional implications of what she was supporting. She was a person with her own views about democratic governance and the appropriate role of the hereditary monarchy within it. Those views were not relevant to the job. The job was the job. She did the job. She said that the volume alone told you something. That the picture you got from the reported letters, the black spider memos, the occasional disclosed communication, was a small fraction of the actual output. That for every letter that had entered the public record, there were many others that had not, and that the aggregate picture of sustained, systematic, specific political intervention across multiple departments of government and multiple policy areas over multiple decades was something that the fragments in the public record did not adequately convey. She said Clarence House understood this, that the management of the public record was not passive, that decisions about what could be released and what had to be resisted and what needed to be managed in advance of potential disclosure were decisions that were made actively, with the specific knowledge of what the full picture contained, and the specific understanding that the full picture was not one the institution wished the public to have. This was the buried thing, not the letters themselves, the scope of them, the picture they assembled when you saw them whole. There is a version of the Charles and Camilla story that has achieved the status of official history. It is the version in which two people who loved each other were kept apart by circumstances and duty and the requirements of an institution that demanded a different kind of marriage, and who found each other again after years of separation and suffering, and who eventually, in 2005, were permitted to formalize a relationship that had been real for decades. It is a love story. Imperfect in its construction, costly to the people caught in its path, but a love story. The household staff did not experience it as a love story. They experienced it as the management of a deception that was conducted over years with the full knowledge and, in its operational dimensions, the direct support of the palace machinery that was simultaneously presenting to the public a version of the Wales marriage in which the deception was not occurring. This is not a moral verdict. It is a description of what the staff witnessed, what they were required to facilitate, what the job asked of them in those years when the gap between the official version and the operational reality was at its widest and required the most active management. The relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles did not pause during Charles's marriage to Diana. This is now part of the historical record in ways it was not for many years. The evidence is extensive and comes from multiple sources. What is less extensively documented is what it looked like from the inside, from the perspective of the people who were present in the household, who managed the schedules and the correspondence and the domestic arrangements, who knew where Charles was and who he was with and what the communication patterns meant. They knew early, some of them from very early in the marriage, not because they had been told, because they had eyes and professional competence and the accumulated experience of people who have learned to read situations accurately, because accurate reading is what their work requires. A former member of the household described the understanding that developed among the senior staff as something that was never formally acknowledged and never needed to be. It existed in the particular quality of how certain arrangements were made, the scheduling of certain engagements, the management of certain communication, the discretion that was applied, with a specificity that went beyond normal palace discretion to particular movements and particular contacts. He said that experienced staff do not need to be told things directly. They observe, they accumulate observations, they reach conclusions. The conclusions reached by the experienced staff about the nature of Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles during the marriage were reached early and held with the professional silence that the institution required. What the professional silence cost them is something that tends not to be part of the official account, because the official account is interested in the principles, in Charles and Camilla and Diana and the triangle that the three of them inhabited and its costs for each of them. The official account is not particularly interested in what it required of the people who were professionally embedded in the management of it. It required a specific kind of complicity, not chosen complicity, structural complicity. The complicity of people who are inside a system and whose continued presence in the system depends on their willingness to maintain the requirements of the system regardless of what those requirements ask of them personally. They maintained those requirements. They maintained them day after day and year after year with the professional composure that the job demanded. They did not speak about what they knew. They did not acknowledge to each other in any traceable way the full picture of what they were all separately carrying. And the picture was this. The marriage that the world was watching and calling troubled was not simply troubled. It was a structure built over a reality that was entirely different from the structure's appearance. The man who appeared on public platforms beside his wife was maintaining in the private spaces of his life a relationship with another woman that had never been abandoned and that was managed with the full awareness of the people whose job it was to manage his affairs. Diana knew. The staff knew she knew. This was visible in ways that the household could not avoid registering. Her distress about it was real and her anger about it was real, and the ways in which both the distress and the anger expressed themselves in the household were real, and the staff absorbed them with the same professional composure they absorbed everything. What they could not absorb was the specific demand that the situation placed on their integrity, because they were people, not instruments of institutional management. People who had their own sense of right and wrong, their own understanding of what they were being required to facilitate, their own private reckoning with the question of what it meant to maintain a professional silence about something that was causing real damage to real people. They maintained the silence, but the reckoning was real, and it cost something that the institution did not account for because the institution in its centuries of experience had learned to treat the costs borne by its staff as simply the cost of the work, not a debt, not an obligation, simply the expected expense of doing what the job required. The Wales marriage from the inside of Charles's household was a different picture from the Wales marriage as seen from Diana's household, or from the public record, or from the sympathetic profiles that positioned Charles as a man who had tried and failed in a marriage that was impossible from the beginning. From the inside of Charles's household, what the staff observed was a man who had significant capacity for the specific cruelty that comes not from heat but from cold. Not the cruelty of someone who loses control and says things they later regret. The cruelty of someone who is entirely in control and who uses that control to make another person feel the full weight of the power differential between them. Diana arrived in Charles's life as someone who needed more than he was constitutionally capable of giving. This much is part of the official record. What is less part of the official record is how Charles responded to that need, how he treated it, what his household observed in terms of his specific behavior toward a young woman who was displaying from very early in the marriage the signs of genuine psychological distress. A senior member of staff who worked closely with Charles's household in the early years of the marriage described his response to Diana's needs with a precision that required choosing every word carefully. She said that Charles was not equipped for what Diana required. She said this with genuine sympathy for the difficulty of his position, for the fact that his own formation had not given him the tools that the situation demanded. But she then said something else. She said that not being equipped is different from not engaging, from deciding that the need itself was something to be managed around rather than something to be addressed, from treating the person expressing the need as a problem to be contained rather than a human being to be helped. She said Charles made that choice, not dramatically, not with visible deliberation, in the daily, accumulated way that choices are made by someone who has always had the option of not engaging with other people's needs, and who has always exercised that option because the option has always been available to him, and because no one in his life has ever required him to exercise it differently. The morning after incidents. This was what the staff noted most consistently. Not the incidents themselves, which were the visible surface of a much deeper fracture. The mornings after. The quality of Charles's behavior in the hours following a night when Diana had been visibly distressed, when the household had been aware of the state she was in, when the evidence of her suffering had been present and unavoidable. He continued. That was the description they returned to with a consistency that suggested it was the accurate word. He continued. He pursued his schedule. He maintained his routines. He engaged with his correspondence and his garden and his architectural interests and the various concerns that occupied his time and attention with the completeness of someone who has not registered that something in the immediate environment requires a response. Whether the not registering was genuine or deliberate is a question the staff could not answer because they were not inside his consciousness. What they could observe was the behavior. And the behavior said, consistently, that the distress of the woman he had married was not something that interrupted the ordinary flow of his day. One equerry described a specific morning. He did not describe what had preceded it because describing it was not something he was willing to do in the account being given. He described the morning itself, Charles at breakfast, the papers, the correspondence, the garden plans. The conversation about the day's schedule conducted with the briskness of someone focused on practical logistics. He said that Diana was not at breakfast. He said this was not unusual. He said that on this particular morning it was specifically not unusual for reasons he did not detail. He said that Charles did not ask about her absence, did not reference the preceding evening, did not ask any member of staff present whether she was all right. He said Charles asked for more coffee. More coffee. The equerry said those two words with the specific flatness of someone delivering a detail that contains in its flatness everything that the account needs to say. More coffee. The staff member brought the coffee. The morning continued, the schedule proceeded, and Diana somewhere in the house was managing whatever she was managing without any indication from the man she had married that her managing of it was something he was aware of or interested in. This was the marriage as the staff of Charles's household experienced it, not the failing of two incompatible people doing their best in an impossible situation. The specific, observed, documented behavior of a man who had the capacity and the choice to engage with another person's distress and who consistently, repeatedly, without visible conflict or regret, chose not to. Every version of Charles that has been buried required someone to do the burying. The buried thing does not bury itself, it requires people. People who know what they know and who make specific decisions about what to do with the knowing. The people who buried the version of Charles that this account is assembling were not, in most cases, bad people. They were not conspirators in the dramatic sense. They were professionals. Talented, often brilliant professionals who had chosen to dedicate their careers to the institution of the British monarchy and who understood with the clarity of people who have spent years inside a system what the institution required of them. What it required was management. The management of narrative, the management of access, the management of the gap between what was known inside and what was understood outside, and the sustained, sophisticated, professional effort required to maintain that gap across decades of intense public scrutiny. The communications team at Clarence House was, by the assessment of people who watched it operate from various positions, one of the most effective media operations in British public life. Not because of the conventional tools of media management, the press releases and the briefings and the management of photographic access, but because of the deeper operation, the cultivation of relationships with journalists and editors, the understanding of what each outlet needed and what each was willing to do in exchange for access, the subtle management of which stories were allowed to develop and which were interrupted at the stage before they became fully formed. A former journalist who covered the royal family over an extended period described the operation with the specific appreciation of someone who had encountered it from the receiving end. He said that Clarence House's understanding of the media was not defensive. It was not an operation designed to respond to coverage. It was an operation designed to shape the conditions in which coverage was produced, to influence the questions that journalists decided to ask and the sources they decided to consult, and the framing through which they decided to present what they found. He said it worked in the sense that operations of that kind work, not completely, not without failures and leaks and the occasional story that got through the management and landed in a way the operation had not anticipated, but substantially, in the aggregate, over time. The aggregate result was the official Charles, the portrait that had been assembled through the selection of which things were visible and which were not, and sustained through the ongoing professional effort of people whose careers depended on its maintenance. Those people knew what they were managing around. They were not naive. They were professionals with direct access to the full picture, the rages and the entitlement and the treatment of Diana and the constitutional overreach and the full scope of the Camilla relationship during the marriage, and they had made specific professional decisions about how to manage the gap between the full picture and the one the public was being given. Some of them made those decisions with the genuine belief that what they were protecting served a legitimate purpose, that the monarchy as an institution was worth protecting, that its stability required the management of information about its members, that the alternative to management was damage not merely to Charles but to an institution that had value beyond any individual within it. Some of them made those decisions with less idealism, with the practical understanding that their careers were inside the institution and that the institution rewarded the management and penalized the disclosure. That loyalty to the official version was professionally required, and that professional requirements, for people who had built their working lives inside a specific environment, have a weight that is not always separable from moral choice. And some of them, the more honest ones in the conversations that happen when careers are over and the professional requirements have been released and the private reckoning can finally be done, made those decisions with something closer to resignation than conviction. with the understanding that they were doing what the system required, and that the system requiring it did not make it right, and that the rightness or wrongness of it was something they were going to have to live with. They live with it. Some of them have begun, in careful and qualified and legally cautious ways, to speak about it. The fragments that have emerged through this speaking, assembled from their various sources across the years, form the picture this account has been describing. Not a complete picture, not the full record that a proper historical accounting would require, and that the institution has worked very hard to ensure will not be assembled in full during the lifetimes of the people who could assemble it, but enough. Enough to see the shape of what was buried. Enough to understand that the official Charles, the misunderstood sensitive man of the sympathetic profiles, is a construction, a professional production of considerable skill sustained over considerable time by people who knew what they were managing around. What they were managing around was a man who could be, in private, very different from the public version, who had a temper that went beyond the occasional passionate outburst of an engaged mind, who treated the people around him with the specific entitlement of someone for whom the rules had never fully applied, who managed the constitutional boundaries of his position as if they were suggestions rather than constraints, who watched the woman he had married suffer and asked for more coffee. Charles became king on the 8th of September 2022, on the death of his mother. He had been waiting for the position for longer than almost any heir in British history. He was 73 years old. He was the oldest person to have acceded to the British throne in recorded history. He acceded with the full weight of the constructed narrative behind him, the decades of management, the official portrait, the version that Clarence House had spent half a century producing and protecting, the sensitive, misunderstood, principled man who had been failed by a fairy tale, and who had found, eventually, the private happiness that the institution had denied him for too long. The world received the new king largely in the terms that the official version offered. There were the dissenting voices, the Republicans and the critics, and the people for whom the hereditary monarchy was itself the problem, regardless of which hereditary monarch occupied the position. But the specific version of Charles that this account has been assembling, the one that the staff and the courtiers and the former equerries and the correspondence secretaries and the household members carried in their internal archives, that version was not part of the official reception. It remains to a significant degree buried. Does it matter, now that he is king, now that the marriage that produced so much damage is decades in the past and Diana is gone and Camilla is queen consort and the official version has achieved the status of settled history? The question answers itself when you ask who is asking it. For the people who absorbed the rages and arranged their lives around the demands and maintained the professional silence about what they witnessed, it matters in the way that all unacknowledged truths matter. Not because acknowledgement would change the past, because acknowledgement is what the past deserves from the people with the power to provide it. For the constitutional question, it matters in the way that character always matters in those who hold power. The letters to ministers did not stop when Charles became king. The pattern of behavior that produced them, the certainty that his views should carry weight in decisions that are constitutionally outside his domain, did not dissolve at the moment of accession. It was formed over decades, and it is structural in a way that a change of title does not address. For the historical record it matters because the historical record is not the official portrait. The historical record is what actually happened and what it actually looked like and what the people inside it actually experienced. The historical record includes the pen thrown in a palace office in the 1980s and the mornings after and the more coffee and the letters to ministers and the full scope of what the correspondence secretaries knew and what the communications teams buried and what the staff carried home in the evenings and managed in their kitchens before they came back the next morning. The historical record includes what the staff saw, and the staff saw something that Clarence House worked very hard to ensure would never be the version the world received. You have now received a version of it, not the full picture. The full picture is still partly buried in the private archives and the personal memories and the conversations that happen in the careful language of people who understand what they risk. But the shape of it, the outline of what was buried and why it was buried and what the burying cost the people who were required to perform it, the shape is visible, and the shape does not look like the official portrait. There is a category of knowledge that has no official home. It cannot be filed. It cannot be cited in any document that carries institutional weight. It cannot be produced in any proceeding that requires evidence in the formal sense of that word. It lives in people, in the specific embodied, unrepeatable memory of individuals who were present in rooms where things happened that the official record does not contain and will not contain, because the official record is produced by the institution and the institution does not produce accounts of itself that damage the version it has chosen. The valets and the butlers and the personal staff who worked closest to Charles over the decades of his adult life carry this knowledge in ways that the more distant members of his household do not. Closeness is its own category. The personal staff who dressed him and traveled with him and attended to the physical reality of his daily existence in its most intimate dimensions had access to a version of him that even the senior courtiers and the communications professionals did not see. They saw him before the performance assembled. They saw him after it was released. They saw the gap between the two and they lived in that gap as their daily working environment. What they saw in that gap was not a simple thing. It was not simply the rages, though the rages were there. It was not simply the entitlement, though the entitlement was structural in a way that went so deep it had stopped being visible to Charles himself. It was something more comprehensive than either of those things. It was the full texture of a private self that had been formed by decades of being treated as the most important person in every room and that had absorbed that treatment so completely that it had become indistinguishable from identity. A former valet who served Charles across several years described the experience of close personal service to him with the economy of someone who has thought carefully about how much to say and has decided that accuracy matters more than protection. He said that Charles was not cruel in the way that the word cruelty implies deliberate infliction of pain. He said that what he was something that in certain respects was harder to work with than deliberate cruelty. He was indifferent, not to everything and not to everyone. He was capable of genuine interest and genuine warmth in specific contexts and with specific people, but to the people whose function was to serve him, to the people whose presence in his life was defined entirely by what they could provide for him, he was indifferent in the way that people are indifferent to the furniture in a room they have lived in for a long time. It is there. It functions. Its functioning is expected. Its failure to function is notable and addressable. Its presence as such does not require acknowledgement. The valet said that in several years of close personal service to the Prince of Wales he was thanked directly, perhaps a handful of times. He said this not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with the precision of someone reporting an observable fact. The thanks were not withheld as punishment. They were not withheld deliberately. They were simply not present in the architecture of how Charles related to the people whose job it was to maintain his physical environment and his personal comfort. He said that Charles walked through a room that had been prepared for him, a room that had required significant labor to prepare to the specific standard required, with the completeness of someone walking through a room that had simply become the way it was. The preparation was invisible to him because people like the valet were invisible to him in the specific sense that their labor and their presence did not require acknowledgement any more than the functioning of a heating system required acknowledgement. You did not thank the heating system. You noticed when it failed. The valet noticed that Charles noticed when things failed with a precision and a speed that was remarkable. The wrong temperature in a bath, the incorrectly prepared breakfast, the slight deviation from the established arrangement of objects on a dressing table. These were noticed immediately and addressed with the specific focused attention of someone for whom the maintenance of his physical environment was a matter of real importance. The correct temperature, the correctly prepared breakfast, the precisely arranged objects, these produced nothing. Not satisfaction, not acknowledgement. Silence, which was the register that meant things were as they should be. This asymmetry, the immediate sharp attention to failure and the complete silence in response to correctness, was described by multiple members of the personal staff across different periods of Charles's life, with a consistency that established it as a pattern rather than an individual experience. It was how he operated. It was the specific texture of what it felt like to work closely for him over an extended period. It produced, the valet said, a particular kind of working relationship with your own performance. You aimed for the invisible, for the absence of response, for the silence that meant nothing had gone wrong. You worked day after day in a direction whose success was defined by not being noticed, and the not being noticed was itself never acknowledged, and the acknowledgement of the not being noticed was never going to come, and you made your peace with that, or you did not make your peace with it and you left. Some left quickly. The turnover among Charles's most personal staff was, by the accounts of those who observed it across the arc of his household's history, higher than was typical for royal service. Royal service generally produced long tenures. The stability of the institution, the specific satisfactions of working in an environment of historical significance, the professional pride of maintaining a standard that had its own tradition and its own weight, these things kept people in place for years and sometimes decades. In Charles's closest personal household, people left more frequently, not dramatically, not in the visible way of someone resigning in protest, in the quiet way of people who have reached the limit of what a specific working environment can ask of them, and who have decided, privately and finally, that the asking has reached its end. They left. They signed their confidentiality agreements, which in royal service are comprehensive documents covering the entirety of what was witnessed during the period of employment. They went into other lives, and they carried what they carried in the internal archive that the confidentiality agreement covered the public expression of but could not touch in its private reality. What they carried was not a simple thing, and was not a villain's portrait, and was not the absence of complexity. Charles was capable of genuine kindness. The personal staff who spent extended time with him described moments of real humanity that complicated the harder picture in ways that made the harder picture more, rather than less, difficult to hold. He could ask about your family with what appeared to be genuine interest. He could remember a detail mentioned weeks earlier and return to it in a way that suggested it had registered as something worth retaining. He could, in moments of genuine engagement with someone he found interesting or sympathetic, be the person that the sympathetic profiles described, thoughtful and curious and capable of a warmth that was real rather than performed. These moments existed. They were real. They were not sufficient to define the experience of close personal service to him, but they were present in the record, and they belong in the account because leaving them out would produce a portrait that was as selective as the official one, only in the opposite direction. The full portrait contains both the genuine moments of warmth and the entitlement that surrounded them, the intellectual curiosity and the rages over pens, the environmental conviction and the constitutional overreach, the man who could make a junior staff member feel genuinely seen, and the man who could make that same staff member feel like a malfunctioning piece of household equipment within the same day. The butlers who served in his various residences across the years described the household from a slightly different angle than the valets. The butler's relationship with a principal is less intimate than the valet's, but in some respects more comprehensive. The butler sees the household as a system. He manages its moving parts and its daily operations and its formal functions and the preparation for and aftermath of events that the principal hosts. He has a wide-angle view where the valet has a close-up one, and the wide-angle view contains things the close-up misses. What the butlers saw in the wide-angle view was a household organized around a single governing principle that expressed itself in every dimension of its operation. The principle was the satisfaction of Charles's requirements to the maximum degree achievable at all times and in all circumstances, and the organization of every other consideration around that primary purpose. This is not unusual in royal households. Royal households are organized around the principle. That is their function and their tradition, and the people who work in them understand this going in and accept it as the terms of the work. What was unusual, the butler said, was the degree, the totality of the organization, and its absolute imperviousness to any competing consideration, however legitimate. The staff's comfort, their reasonable working conditions, their ability to function as human beings with human needs that occasionally intersected with the requirements of the household in ways that required accommodation. These things were not part of the equation in ways that the more experienced among the butlers had not encountered to this degree in other royal service. One former butler described a specific situation involving a member of staff with a family medical emergency. The emergency was real and urgent and required the staff member to leave the household at a moment that was not convenient in terms of the day's operational requirements. The leaving was managed, the cover was arranged, the day's requirements were met. But the manner in which the situation was handled, the specific way in which the inconvenience to the household's operations was treated as the primary concern and the human emergency that had produced the inconvenience as a secondary one, was something the butler described with the careful language of someone reporting an observable fact, rather than making a moral judgment. He said that the staff member's emergency was addressed in terms of its logistical implications, that the question that was asked in the conversation that established that the staff member needed to leave was about coverage, about who would fill the role, about how the operational gap would be managed. He said that the question that was not asked was whether the staff member was all right, whether there was anything the household could do for them beyond the logistical management of their absence. He said this was not an aberration, it was the consistent register of how that household related to its staff as human beings rather than operational components. The operational reality was attended to with precision and competence. The human reality underneath the operational one was not part of the attention. He said you adjusted to it, you had to adjust to it or you could not do the work. You learned to not require the acknowledgement. You learned to find your professional satisfaction in the standard of the work itself, rather than in any response the work produced from the person it served. You learned to separate yourself from the work in the specific way that allows a person to maintain their own dignity inside an environment that does not attend to that dignity. He said some people learned it better than others. He said some people never quite learned it. He said those were the ones who left. The leaving happened quietly. The arriving happened quietly. The work continued. The household functioned. The official portrait was maintained by the communications professionals and the carefully cultivated journalists and the institutional machinery that had been managing it for decades. And in the back rooms and the service corridors and the staff quarters and the lives that the personal staff went home to, the other knowledge existed, intact, specific, carried by the people who had acquired it through the irreplaceable method of being there. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. They can be silenced by legal agreements and professional obligation and the weight of what they risk by speaking, but they cannot be emptied. The knowledge stays, the specific, embodied, unrepeatable knowledge of what it was like to be in those rooms. It stays until the conditions for speaking about it change, until the careers are over or the principles are dead, or the legal agreements have aged past the point of practical enforceability, or the person simply reaches the point where the carrying has gone on long enough and the truth deserves its place in the record. Some of them are reaching that point, slowly, carefully, in the hedged and qualified and legally cautious language of people who understand what they are doing and have chosen to do it anyway. The record is being built, fragment by fragment, account by account, piece by piece, and the picture it builds is not the official portrait. Children see things that adults believe are not being seen. This is one of the most consistent findings of developmental psychology and one of the most consistently underestimated facts in the real world, where adults continue to behave in the presence of their children as if the children's understanding is limited by their age in ways that protect the adults from accountability for what the children are actually absorbing. William and Harry were not protected by their ages. They were observant children in a household where there was an enormous amount to observe, and they observed it with the accuracy of children who have learned that the adult world is not what it presents itself to be and that accurate mapping of it is a survival skill. What they observed about their father was not the version of him that the official narrative required. Harry has spoken. This is now part of the public record in ways that the institution spent considerable energy and resource attempting to prevent. The memoir, the interviews, the documentary, the detailed and specific and legally carefully constructed accounts that Harry has provided of his experience of his father and of the institution that his father represents, constitute the most significant breach in the official portrait since the Morton book 3 decades earlier. The institution's response to Harry speaking was the institutional response to all significant breaches: management, delegitimization, the deployment of the official version with greater force and greater frequency in the spaces adjacent to the breach, so that the breach itself is surrounded by the official version and the contrast makes the breach look like the aberration rather than the revelation. The management was partially successful. It is always partially successful. The official version has resources that the individual speaking against it does not have, in terms of institutional credibility and media relationships and the accumulated authority of an organization that has been managing its narrative for centuries. Harry's account was received by a significant portion of the British public through the filter of that authority, and the filter transformed the reception in ways that served the institution. But the account itself remains, and the account describes a father who was capable of the full range of the behaviors that this script has been assembling from the staff testimony and the courtier accounts and the buried fragments of the private record. Harry described a father who was not present in the emotional sense during the years when his mother was suffering, who was not present in the years of her deterioration and her distress and the household's management of both, who was present in the formal sense, the schedule maintained, the engagements attended, the public appearances made alongside a wife who was visibly struggling in ways that the public was beginning to see and that the household had been managing for years. But not present in the sense that a father's presence means something to children who are watching their mother suffer and who are looking with the specific desperate attention of children in that situation for evidence that one of the adults is going to do something. He described the coldness, not in those terms exactly, in the specific terms of his own experience, the particular quality of his father's manner toward him and toward William in the moments when they needed something from him that went beyond the performance of paternal role at official occasions, the quality of what was available when you needed something real and looked toward the parent who remained and found that what was available was something more managed than real, more correct than present. He described the anger, again in his own terms, the specific incidents that his memory had retained with the clarity of childhood experiences that are retained because they registered as significant at the time of their occurrence, the way the anger operated, its register, its relationship to what had apparently provoked it, the aftermath. William has not spoken in the same way and shows no indication of intending to. William is inside the institution in a way that Harry is not, and the institution has his loyalty in ways that make the speaking that Harry has done not available to him as an option he can exercise without costs that he has apparently decided he is not willing to pay. This is not a judgment. It is a description of the position he occupies and the constraints it generates. But William's silence is not the absence of knowledge, it is the management of knowledge. The professional, careful, institutionally appropriate management of information about his father that the heir to the throne is required to maintain. The silence is itself a kind of testimony to what the silence is managing, because silence is of this specific quality, maintained with this specific care in this specific context, are not the silences of people who have nothing to say. They are the silences of people who have been told what the saying would cost, and who have made their calculation. The calculation is understandable, the cost is real. The institution has demonstrated across the arc of Harry's experience what it does to people who say the things the silence is managing. It has demonstrated this comprehensively and without excessive subtlety, and the demonstration was itself a communication to everyone inside the institution about the terms of continued membership. William received the communication, he is inside the terms. What he knows about his father, accumulated across a lifetime of proximity and observation that began in the specific crucible of the Wales marriage and has continued through the decades of public and private life since, is not part of any official record and is not going to become part of any official record in the foreseeable future, but it is there, in the internal archive, in the specific embodied knowledge of someone who was inside that household as a child, and who absorbed what was there to be absorbed with the accuracy of a child who understood, earlier than he should have had to understand, that the truth and the official version were not the same thing, and that navigating the distance between them was going to be the work of his life. The sons of Charles carry knowledge that the institution has managed and will continue to manage. One of them has begun to release it, one of them has not. Both of them have it. And the knowledge they carry was formed in the same rooms and the same corridors and the same households that the staff were moving through. The same rooms where the rages happened and the mornings after were managed and more coffee was asked for. And Diana moved through her distress in a house that did not attend to it. The children saw it from closer than anyone. They saw it before they had language for it, and they spent years finding the language, and they have, in their different ways and with their different calculations about what the finding costs, been dealing with what they found ever since. Nothing that has been described in this account is new in the sense of being without precedent. The burial of inconvenient truths about powerful individuals by the institutions those individuals represent is not a modern invention and is not specific to the British monarchy. It is a feature of all institutional power across all of recorded history that the institution manages the narrative of its members, because the narrative of its members is the narrative of the institution and the institution's survival depends on the narrative. What is specific to the British monarchy is the particular sophistication of the management, the centuries of practice, the accumulated institutional wisdom about how to produce and maintain a public version that serves the institution's purposes while managing the gap between that version and the reality with sufficient skill that the gap remains invisible to the people outside it. The monarchy has survived things that should have destroyed it. It has survived the abdication and the war and the Suez humiliation and the death of Diana and the Andrew catastrophe and the Sussex departure and the ongoing revelations of what the institution actually looks like from inside. It has survived these things not because it was innocent of the damage done in its name, but because the management of what was known and what was permitted to be known was sufficiently effective to prevent the accumulated picture from assembling itself in public consciousness in a way that demanded a reckoning. The reckoning keeps being deferred. Each time it approaches, the management intensifies. Each time it intensifies, something is buried or managed or delegitimized or simply waited out, because the institution understands that time is one of its primary resources and that things which are not immediately resolved tend, in the absence of sustained pressure, to become historical rather than current, and historical things have less immediate force. Charles, now king, benefits from this management as he has always benefited from it. The official portrait has been updated for the accession. The sensitive, misunderstood man has been replaced by the mature and thoughtful king, the man who waited and worked and demonstrated across decades of service the qualities that the position requires. The environmental advocacy has been reframed as prescience. The architectural campaigns have been softened into evidence of genuine concern. The long relationship with Camilla has been retroactively normalized by the marriage and the title and the decades of public presence that have made her the queen consort in the public's working understanding, if not in its warmest feelings. The rages are not part of this portrait. The treatment of Diana is not part of this portrait. The constitutional overreach is acknowledged in the version that presents it as evidence of passion rather than as evidence of a man who believed that the rules did not apply to him. The treatment of staff is not part of any version that the institution has produced or would produce. The staff are still there, not the same individuals, though some of them remain in royal service in various capacities. The institution is there. The household continues. The new king has his requirements and his standards and his ways of operating that the people who serve him have learned and manage with the professional competence that royal service demands. What those people see in the current royal household is their knowledge to carry. The accounts in this script are historical in the sense that they describe a past that is now the record of a king rather than a prince, but they are not irrelevant. Character formed over 7 decades does not transform at accession. The patterns that the staff and the courtiers and the former equerries and the personal secretaries described are not patterns that the weight of the crown dissolves. They are the patterns of the man inside the institution, the man that Clarence House worked very hard to ensure the world would not see clearly. Some of the world is beginning to see more clearly. The fragments are accumulating. The accounts are emerging with the slow patience of truths that have been waiting for the conditions to speak into and that are finding those conditions more available than they were a decade ago and considerably more available than they were 3 decades ago. The picture is not complete. It will not be complete in the lifetimes of most of the people who could complete it. The institution will ensure that. The institution has been ensuring it for longer than any of the individuals currently inside it have been alive, and it will continue ensuring it with the sustained professional intelligence of an organization that has made the management of its own narrative one of its primary and most practiced skills. But the shape of the buried thing is visible. The outline of what was managed and what was buried and what it cost the people who were required to perform the burying. The shape of a man who was not the official portrait, who was something more complicated and something less flattering and something more human in the specific sense that human beings are always more complicated than the portraits institutions make of them. The shape is visible. and the staff who made it visible by carrying it, quietly and carefully and at considerable personal cost across the years of their service, deserve to have their carrying acknowledged. They knew first. They always know first. They knew it from the rooms where the history actually happened, before it was managed into the version that arrived in the newspapers and the official statements and the sympathetic profiles and the carefully curated photographs of a king who looks, from the outside, exactly like the portrait that was made for him. From the inside, the staff knew something else. They knew it completely, and they took it home with them every night and brought it back every morning and carried it for as long as the carrying was required. And some of them, finally, are setting it down. There is a question that sits underneath everything this account has described and that the account has not yet directly addressed. Not the question of what Charles was. That picture has been assembled across the preceding parts with sufficient detail that its outline is clear. The question underneath that question, the one that requires a different kind of attention, how? How does a person become the specific thing that Charles became? How does a human being arrive at the particular formation of entitlement and coldness and constitutional certainty and the specific indifference to the people around him that the staff described and the courtiers managed and the institution buried? How does someone get to the place where a pen that does not work produces 4 minutes of rage directed at the people in the room, where a wife's distress does not interrupt the morning schedule, where letters to government ministers about matters entirely outside the constitutional remit are sent with the casual confidence of someone who has never seriously entertained the possibility that the rules governing other people apply to him? It does not happen in adulthood. It does not happen at the moment of accession or at any other specific point that could be identified and addressed. It happens in childhood, in the specific daily accumulated experience of growing up inside a system that tells you through every mechanism available to a system that you are different, that the normal rules of human interaction do not fully apply to you, that your needs and your preferences and your reactions are more important than the needs and preferences and reactions of the people around you, not because you have earned that importance but because you were born into it. Charles was born into it on the 14th of November 1948. He was born into the most elaborately managed system of human exceptionalism that the modern world contained. From the moment of his birth, the entire apparatus of the British monarchy, its staff and its protocol and its formal structures and its centuries of accumulated tradition, was oriented around him in ways that expressed, in every daily interaction, the singular importance of his existence. This is not a criticism of his parents specifically, though his parents' specific failures are part of the story. It is a description of a system that has been producing people like Charles for centuries because the production of people like Charles is what the system is designed to do. The heir to the throne must believe in the importance of the throne and in his own fitness to occupy it. The institution that depends for its survival on the continuation of the hereditary principle cannot afford an heir who is uncertain about the fundamental legitimacy of what he represents. So it produces certainty, through every mechanism available to it, through the protocol that places him first in every room, through the deference that surrounds him from birth, through the education that teaches him the history of his lineage as the history of the nation, through the staff who organize their professional lives around his requirements, through the courtiers who translate his preferences into the world's obligations, through the entire elaborate machinery of a system that has been telling the same person the same thing since the day he arrived in it. You are different, you matter more, the rules are different for you. A child who is told this consistently and comprehensively and from birth does not become a balanced adult. They become the adult that Charles became, capable of genuine qualities, capable of real intellectual engagement and real conviction and real moments of human connection, and also shaped at the level of basic assumption about how the world works and what it owes them in ways that no amount of education or experience or self-awareness is going to fully reach. Because the assumption is not conscious. That is the key. The assumption that produced the pen-throwing and the morning after indifference and the constitutional letters and the specific coldness toward the people whose function was to serve him, that assumption was not something Charles chose in any moment you could identify. It was the water he swam in, the air he breathed, the operating system that had been installed before he had the cognitive capacity to evaluate it, and that ran underneath every subsequent experience. The Queen and Prince Philip were not cruel parents in any obvious sense. They were products of their own formations, Philip shaped by a wartime naval career and a displaced European childhood that had its own particular costs. Elizabeth shaped by the weight of the crown she had not sought and the understanding that the crown's requirements superseded everything, including the requirements of her own children. They were not warm parents. This is part of the record and is not seriously disputed by anyone who has looked at it carefully. The Queen's primary relationship was with the institution, and the demands the institution made on her time and her attention left limited residue for the kind of consistent, present, emotionally attuned parenting that produces children who grow up with a secure and balanced sense of themselves. Charles was sent to boarding school at 8 years old. This was the tradition, and the tradition was followed without apparent serious consideration of whether the tradition served the child. The school was Chima, then Gordonstown in Scotland, a school famous for its physical rigor and its particular philosophy about the relationship between hardship and character. Prince Philip had attended Gordonstown and believed in it with the conviction of someone for whom a specific formative experience has become a general prescription. Charles hated it. This is documented not in fragments but in the direct accounts of his own experience that he gave in interviews across the years. He hated it with the specific and sustained misery of a child who is sensitive and who has been placed in an environment that has no use for sensitivity and that treats it as a weakness to be overcome rather than a quality to be developed. He was bullied, not occasionally, systematically, by boys who understood that the heir to the throne was both a target and someone who could not effectively retaliate through the channels available to ordinary children. He wrote to his parents. The letters described what was happening. His parents were not absent in the logistical sense. They received the letters. They were aware of the situation. The response they provided was not the response of parents who understand that their child is suffering and that the suffering requires them to act. It was the response of parents who had decided that the hardship was the point, that endurance was what was being built, that the sensitivity Charles was expressing in his letters was itself the problem that the school was correctly addressing. He endured. He learned in the specific way that children learn things that are taught through sustained application, that the expression of suffering did not produce the response it should produce. That the people who should respond to his suffering had decided that his suffering was a feature rather than a problem, that the correct response to a world that did not accommodate his needs was not to expect accommodation but to stop showing need. He learned to stop showing need. He became the adult who asked for more coffee. There is a direct line, not a simple line, not a line that reduces the complexity of an adult personality to a single childhood experience, but a line. The child who learned that his suffering was not going to be attended to by the people with the power to attend to it, became the adult who did not attend to the suffering of the people around him. The child who learned that endurance was the required response became the adult whose emotional vocabulary did not contain the responses that other people's endurance required. He became, in the specific way that people become what they are taught to become by the sustained instruction of their formative environment, the man the staff described, the man who asked for more coffee. Understanding this does not require forgiveness of the consequences for the people who served him, and for Diana and for the constitutional health of the institution he now leads, are real, regardless of the explanation for how he became what he became. Explanation is not exoneration. Understanding the formation does not change the record of the behavior, but it changes the nature of the account. It moves it from the territory of the simple villain portrait, which is as reductive and as dishonest as the official portrait, into the territory of the complicated human truth. The territory where people are produced by specific systems and specific experiences, and where the production has costs for everyone inside it, including the person produced. Charles was produced by the most elaborate system of human exceptionalism that the modern world contained, and the production had costs. The costs were paid primarily by the people around him, by the staff who absorbed the rages and managed the indifference, by Diana who received the full weight of a personality that had been formed into something that could not give her what she needed, by the institution itself, which spent decades managing the gap between what had been produced and what a constitutional monarchy in the modern world required its head to be, but also by Charles himself, not in the ways that excuse the behavior, in the ways that make the portrait complete. The man who cannot acknowledge the people who serve him is also the man who cannot be fully known by anyone. The armor that the formation installed is not selective. It does not protect you from the people whose suffering you choose to ignore, while leaving you open to genuine connection with the people you choose to attend to. It operates comprehensively. It keeps everything at the managed distance that the formation required. The man who became king after 73 years of waiting, who had devoted decades to causes he genuinely believed in, and who had suffered genuine costs in his personal life, that the official portrait's emphasis on his sensitivity was not entirely wrong to register. That man was also someone who had been prevented by the system that made him from being fully human in the ordinary sense, from being present, from being available, from being capable of the simple, unrehearsed human responses that the people around him needed and that the system had ensured he would never fully develop. Both things, always in the end both things, the man who caused the damage and the man who was himself a product of damage. The man who should be held accountable for what the staff described, and the man whose formation makes the accounting more complicated than simple condemnation allows. The architecture of his entitlement was built before he was old enough to consent to it. This does not mean he bears no responsibility for the structure he inhabited and the damage it produced. It means that the responsibility is located inside a larger story about systems and formations and what institutions do to the people they produce and what the produced people do to the people around them. The staff understood this, some of them. The ones who had been in the work long enough and who had seen enough of how the system operated to understand that what they were managing was not simply the behavior of an individual, but the output of a machine that had been running for centuries and that produced, reliably and without apparent awareness of the cost, people who operated the way Charles operated. They understood it and they managed it and they went home at the end of the day and they put it down as much as it could be put down and they came back the next morning, because that was the job. And the job in that institution was always larger than any individual inside it, even the one at the center, especially the one at the center. There is a specific relationship between the British press and the British royal family that has no precise equivalent in any other country, and that has been built over centuries into something so complex and so mutually dependent that describing it accurately requires acknowledging simultaneously that it is a free press covering a public institution and a managed arrangement in which access and favor and the specific rewards of royal proximity are deployed with considerable sophistication to shape what gets written and how. The management of Charles's coverage was not an accident. It was not the natural result of a press that found him sympathetic and chose to represent him accordingly. It was the result of a specific, sustained, professionally executed relationship between the palace communications apparatus and the journalists and editors whose coverage mattered, a relationship that was built on the exchange of access for tone and that operated with sufficient subtlety that the people inside it could tell themselves with some justification that what was happening was legitimate journalism rather than institutional management. It was both, simultaneously, in the proportions that varied by occasion and by individual, but that, in the aggregate across the decades of coverage, produced a press record of Charles that served the official portrait with the consistency that the official portrait's survival required. The royal correspondents were the primary mechanism. These were journalists who had made the British royal family their professional specialization and who depended for their professional functioning on the access that the palace controlled. A royal correspondent without palace access was a royal correspondent without material. The access was not unconditional, it was extended or restricted in direct relationship to the use that was made of it. Correspondents who produced coverage that the palace found useful found their access maintained and sometimes expanded. Correspondents who produced coverage that the palace found damaging found their access reduced in the quiet, undramatic, entirely deniable way that access is reduced by institutions that have learned to manage it through preference rather than prohibition. This mechanism was not invented for Charles. It had been operating across the full span of the modern monarchy's media relationship, and it worked with the reliability of a system that both sides found functional. The palace got the coverage management it needed. The correspondents got the access their professional functioning required. The arrangement was understood by everyone inside it and was not spoken about outside it with any precision, because speaking about it precisely would have required acknowledging it as something other than straightforward journalism, which would have been uncomfortable for everyone involved. What was specific to Charles's coverage was the particular sophistication of the management during the years when the marriage was disintegrating and the private picture was most at risk of becoming public. The years between the Morton book and the separation and the Panorama interview and the eventual divorce were years in which the official portrait was under sustained and escalating pressure, and the management of that pressure required the communications apparatus to operate at the upper limit of its capacity. A senior communications professional who worked in proximity to the palace operation during this period described the management of those years with the careful retrospective honesty of someone who has had time to assess what they were part of. He said that the operation during the Diana years was the most demanding communications management he had observed in his professional life, not because the material being managed was most challenging, though it was very challenging, because the gap being managed was most visible, because the distance between the official version and what people were beginning to see was growing at a rate that required increasingly intensive management to maintain. He said that intensive management at that scale required the active cooperation of the press in ways that went beyond the normal operation of the access exchange. It required specific journalists to be briefed with specific information that was designed not merely to provide material for stories, but to shape the framework through which other stories would be received. It required the cultivation of relationships with editors at a level above the royal correspondence, relationships that gave the palace a view into what was being prepared and what interventions were required before publication rather than after. He described a specific category of intervention that he characterized as the preemptive management of damaging material. When information about Charles that the palace considered damaging was in the process of being assembled by a journalist or publication, the response was not to wait for publication and respond. The response was to engage early, to offer something, a piece of access, a confirmation of something less damaging, a relationship signal that communicated to the publication that cooperation on this matter would be remembered favorably when future access decisions were made. He said this worked more often than people outside the operation would expect. He said it worked because the publications needed the access and because the people making editorial decisions understood the exchange even when it was never spoken about in those terms. He said it worked because the palace had been doing it for long enough that the doing of it had become part of the understood landscape of royal journalism rather than something that required active negotiation each time. What it produced in Charles's coverage was a flaw. A minimum level of sympathetic framing below which the mainstream coverage generally did not go during the years when it mattered most. The specific incidents, the rages, the treatment of Diana from the inside of his household, the full scope of the constitutional letters, the texture of what the personal staff carried, none of this entered the mainstream coverage in the forms that would have required the official portrait to be fundamentally revised. It existed at the edges, in the occasional piece that had gotten past the management, in the foreign press that operated outside the access exchange and that could therefore produce coverage unconstrained by the relationship maintenance that domestically constrained what could be written, in the private conversations of journalists who knew more than they were printing and who were printing what the professional architecture of their situation permitted them to print, but not in the mainstream, not in the volume and the specificity and the assembled picture that would have constituted a reckoning. The management prevented the reckoning. The management that was operated by the communications professionals with the willing cooperation of journalists who understood the terms of the access they depended on. Some of those journalists have spoken about this in the years since their active coverage ended. In the memoirs and the retrospective interviews and the academic discussions about the relationship between the press and the palace that have become more candid as the people inside the relationship have moved to positions outside it from which candor is more available. They describe the arrangement with varying degrees of discomfort, some with the professional equanimity of people who have decided that what they did was within the acceptable parameters of their industry and whose assessments of acceptable are calibrated to what the industry normalized, some with more visible discomfort, some with the specific retrospective honesty of people who have looked at what their coverage produced and what it enabled, and who have reached conclusions about it that are not flattering. The conclusions are not flattering because the coverage enabled the burial, The sympathetic profiles and the managed access and the preemptive interventions and the flaw of minimum sympathetic framing that the management maintained, all of it contributed to the burial of the version that the staff and the courtiers and the former equerries and the personal secretaries carried. The press was not the only mechanism of the burial. It was one mechanism among several, but it was the most publicly visible mechanism and therefore the most important one in terms of what the public received and what the public was prevented from receiving. The public received the official portrait, maintained by the palace communications apparatus with the cooperation of the press that depended on the palace for its access and that understood, without the need for explicit articulation, the terms of the relationship. The public did not receive the version that the staff knew. That is what the management was for. That is what it achieved, until the conditions changed, until the management encountered pressures it had not fully anticipated, until the people who had been carrying the knowledge reached the point where the carrying had gone on long enough. The burial is not complete. It was never going to be complete. It was always a management operation, not a suppression operation, and the distinction matters because management has limits and suppression, when it works, does not. The limits are being reached, slowly, with the patience of truth that has been waiting for the conditions to speak into and that has found those conditions more available than they were before. The management is still running. It is running right now, as this account is being heard. The professionals at the palace are doing what they do with the skill and the institutional intelligence of an organization that has been doing it for longer than any of them have been alive. But the fragments are accumulating. The accounts are emerging. The picture is assembling itself from pieces that the management could slow but could not stop. The shape is visible. Institutions that bury truths about their members pay a price, not always immediately, not always visibly, not in the dramatic way that individual accountability produces consequences that can be directly traced to the decisions that generated them. They pay in the slow erosion of the thing that institutions of this kind depend on above all other things: trust. Not the passive trust of people who have no information to disturb their confidence in the institution, the active trust of people who have looked at the institution clearly and found it worth trusting anyway, the trust that survives scrutiny, the trust that is based on something real. The British monarchy's survival across centuries of change and challenge has been attributed to many things: the stability it provides, the ceremonial continuity it embodies, the constitutional function it performs, the cultural identity it represents. All of these explanations contain truth and none of them is sufficient. The deeper explanation is trust. The belief, held by sufficient numbers of people at sufficient intensity, that the institution is what it says it is, that the portrait is not entirely a construction, that underneath the management and the official version and the carefully produced imagery of public service and constitutional continuity, there is something genuine, something that earns the extraordinary position the institution occupies in British public life. The burial of inconvenient truths is a bet against trust. It is a decision, made repeatedly and in aggregate across the decades of institutional management, that the trust will hold better if the inconvenient truths are not known than if they are. That the active trust of people who have seen the full picture is less valuable than the passive trust of people who have not been required to look at it. This calculation may be correct in the short term. In the management of specific incidents and specific revelations and specific moments of crisis, the burial and the management and the official portrait have repeatedly demonstrated their effectiveness. The trust has held. The institution has survived. The portrait has maintained its integrity against pressures that should have destroyed it. The calculation compounds over time. Each burial adds to the gap between the official version and the reality. Each addition to the gap requires more intensive management to maintain it. Each intensification of the management is itself a risk because intensive management is visible to people inside the institution and those people carry what they see. And the people carrying what they see eventually reach conditions in which the carrying has gone on long enough and the truth finds its way out regardless of the management. The Sussex departure. This is the most recent and in some respects the most significant data point in the long history of the monarchy's management of its own narrative. Harry and Meghan left. They left with the full force of their experience of the institution behind them, and with the decision, made after exhausting other options, that speaking was necessary even at the cost of institutional membership. What they said when they spoke was not fully believed by everyone who heard it. The management had prepared the ground. The delegitimization operation had been running before the speaking began and had produced in a significant portion of the British public a skepticism about the speakers that influenced the reception of what they said. The management was effective to a degree, but not to the degree that mattered most, because what the Sussex departure and the subsequent speaking produced was not merely the specific content of the specific accounts. It produced a question, the question that the management had been preventing from being asked with sufficient seriousness for decades. What is actually happening inside that institution? The question, once asked with sufficient public seriousness, does not go away. It generates subsequent questions. It changes the frame through which subsequent revelations are received. It makes the management visible in a way that the management by definition cannot survive being visible. Because the management works by being invisible, and a visible management is a failed management. The question is now being asked, not by everyone, not with the uniformity of a public that has reached a single verdict, but by enough people with enough seriousness that the institutional response to it can no longer be the simple deployment of the official portrait with additional force. The additional force is itself now part of what people are looking at. The management is now being managed, and managing the management is a task of a different order of difficulty from managing the original material. Charles is king in this environment. He acceded to a throne in an institution that is managing a trust problem that the burial of truths across decades has helped to produce. He is managing it with the same apparatus that has always managed it: the communications professionals and the press relationships and the access exchanges and the careful cultivation of the official portrait in its updated form. He is also managing it as a man whose specific character and specific behavior and specific treatment of the people around him is part of what requires managing. The buried truths about Charles are not merely inconvenient revelations about a historical prince. They are relevant to the current king. They speak to the character of the man who now leads the institution that is managing the trust problem that the burial of truths has helped to produce. The institution that buries truths about its members and the member whose truths have been buried are now the same thing in a way they were not before the accession. Charles's character is the institution's character in the way that the monarch's character always becomes the institution's character when the monarch is on the throne. This is the cost, not the dramatic immediate cost of a scandal that produces a resignation or a reckoning. The slow compounding cost of an institution whose trust problem is being managed by the same mechanisms that helped to produce it. The cost of a management operation trying to manage its own visibility. The cost of a buried truth that is not fully buried and not fully revealed, and that sits in the space between those states as a persistent question that the institution cannot answer without destroying the portrait, and cannot leave unanswered without the portrait continuing to erode. The staff who carried the knowledge paid their costs. They paid them in the evenings in their kitchens and in the specific fatigue of sustained double consciousness, and in the carrying that the confidentiality agreements covered the expression of but could not reach in its private reality. The institution is now paying its costs, in the trust erosion and the succession anxiety and the Republican sentiment that grows in the space that management leaves open, and in the persistent question that the Sussex departure made unavoidable. The question of what is actually happening inside that institution, the question that the staff could answer, that some of them are beginning to answer, in the careful, qualified, legally cautious fragments that are assembling themselves, despite the management and because of the conditions that the management could slow but not prevent, into the picture that the official portrait was produced to obscure. The picture is not complete. It will not be complete in the lifetimes of most of the people who could complete it, but the shape is here, assembled from the fragments that the management could not suppress, and the accounts of the people who were there, and the slow patient accumulation of truth that institutions can delay but cannot permanently prevent. The shape of a man and an institution, and the gap between what both of them presented and what the people inside them actually experienced. The shape of a buried thing, becoming visible. There is a particular kind of person that institutions of this kind produce in abundance, not the principles, not the people at the center whose names are known and whose faces are recognized and whose behavior is the subject of the accounts being assembled here. The people around the center, the ones whose names do not appear in the newspapers except in the formal listings of official engagements. the ones whose professional identity is defined entirely by their proximity to someone more important than themselves, and whose entire career is built on the maintenance of that proximity and on the specific skills that proximity requires. The courtiers. The word itself is ancient. It carries the weight of centuries of the specific human type it describes. The person whose function is to serve the powerful, whose judgment is deployed in the service of the powerful person's interests, whose loyalty is absolute in the specific sense that it is not contingent on the powerful person deserving it. Charles's inner circle across the decades of his public life was composed of people of this type, not exclusively, not without variation. There were individuals within it who brought genuine independent judgment and genuine professional integrity to their work, and who maintained those qualities in ways that occasionally produced friction with the person they served. But the gravitational pull of the position was always toward the other type, the type that had refined the skill of telling the person at the center what the person at the center wanted to hear into something approaching an art form. The type whose usefulness depended on their ability to validate the existing view and manage the people who challenged it, rather than on their ability to provide the honest assessment that the existing view required. A former senior advisor who worked within Charles's household for several years described the inner circle dynamic with the precision of someone who had observed it from inside and who had, after leaving, reached the distance necessary to describe what the inside had looked like. He said that the defining characteristic of Charles's inner circle was not loyalty in the straightforward sense. It was something more specific. It was the skill of managing Charles's perception of the world in ways that confirmed his existing understanding of it, while creating the appearance of genuine engagement with alternatives. He said Charles was not a man who was easy to advise honestly, not because he was hostile to honesty in any explicit sense, not because he would have said, if asked directly, that he preferred to be told what he wanted to hear. He would not have said that. He would have said, and appeared to believe, that he valued honest counsel and that the people around him were providing it. What they were providing, the former advisor said, was something that looked like honest counsel and functioned as validation. The distinction was subtle enough that Charles could not see it from inside it. The people providing it understood the distinction completely. The mechanism was not crude. It was not simple agreement with everything Charles said followed by enthusiastic reinforcement of whatever he had already decided. That would have been visible and would not have served the purpose. The mechanism was more sophisticated. It involved genuine engagement with the material, real analysis of real questions, the deployment of actual intelligence in the assessment of actual problems, and then the shaping of the output of that genuine engagement toward conclusions that aligned with what Charles had already indicated he wanted to reach. Not falsification. Emphasis. The selection of which evidence to foreground and which to treat as less significant. The framing of the analysis in terms that made the preferred conclusion feel like the inevitable one, rather than the chosen one. The management of the conversation around the analysis so that the alternative conclusions were present enough that Charles could not accuse the process of being incomplete, but not present enough that they carried real weight in the room. This is how you survive as an advisor to someone like Charles. This is what the inner circle learned, some of them quickly and some of them after more painful lessons, was the skill that the position required. Not honesty, not dishonesty. The sophisticated middle thing that allowed you to function professionally while serving a principal whose relationship with honest assessment was complicated by the specific formation that had produced him. The former advisor described a specific type of conversation that he had witnessed repeatedly in his years in the household, a conversation about a decision that Charles had already made internally before the formal discussion began. A conversation whose function was not to reach a decision but to produce a record of a decision-making process that would satisfy the requirements of accountability while changing nothing about the decision that had already been reached. He said these conversations had a specific quality that you learned to recognize, a particular kind of purposeful energy in the room that was not the energy of genuine inquiry, the energy of performance, of people who understood what the conversation was for, and who were performing their roles in it with the professional competence that palace service required, while understanding that the performance was exactly what it was. He said Charles performed in these conversations too, not cynically. This is important. He was not a man sitting at the head of the table and consciously manufacturing a false process. He was a man who had been told his entire life that his judgment was sound, and whose inner circle had been carefully selecting for people who confirmed that telling, and who had reached a place where the manufactured process felt, from the inside, like genuine deliberation. He could not see it from inside it. This is the specific tragedy of the formation. The entitlement is invisible to the person it inhabits, because the people around the person have made it invisible. The inner circle that confirmed the existing view was the product of a selection process that Charles had not consciously designed, but that had operated with the reliability of a natural system. People who challenged the view too directly did not last. People who confirmed it reliably did. The selection produced an inner circle that reflected Charles back to himself in the form he found most comfortable. And Charles, surrounded by this reflection, continued to believe that what he was seeing was the world rather than a mirror. The letters to ministers were the most visible product of this dynamic. Not the only product, the most visible one. The constitutional overreach that the letters represented was enabled by an inner circle that had the professional expertise to explain to Charles why the letters were constitutionally problematic, and that either did not provide that explanation or provided it in a form that did not carry sufficient weight to change the behavior. Why did they not stop it? This is the question the former advisor was asked. He was asked it directly, and he answered it with the honesty of someone who has been asking himself the same question for long enough to have reached an answer he was not proud of. He said that stopping it would have required a different kind of courage than the inner circle had developed the habit of exercising. It would have required the specific courage of telling the most powerful person in your professional world something he did not want to hear with enough force and enough persistence to actually change his behavior, rather than simply recording your dissent for the protection of your own conscience. He said that recording your dissent for the protection of your own conscience was what happened. The dissent was noted in meetings, in private conversations, in the careful professional language of advisors who understood the constitutional problem and said so. And then the noting was done, and the behavior continued, and the inner circle continued to function, and the letters continued to be sent, because the alternative to the inner circle's functioning was the inner circle's dissolution, and the people inside it had made the calculation that functioning inside the system was more valuable than the alternative, which was not functioning inside any system at all. This calculation is understandable. It is also the calculation that enabled everything this account has described. The rages went unaddressed because the inner circle had learned not to address them. The treatment of Diana went unmanaged from the Charles side, because the inner circle had learned that managing it was not something that Charles wanted managed. The constitutional overreach continued because the inner circle had learned that the dissent it recorded was not the same as the resistance it did not provide. The inner circle enabled it all, not through malice, through the specific moral compromise that proximity to unaccountable power always produces in the people who choose to remain in that proximity, rather than paying the cost of leaving. The cost of leaving was real. The former advisor paid it. He described it with the directness of someone who had made a decision he believed was right, and who carried the professional costs of it without excessive complaint, but without pretending they were not real. He lost the access. The network that palace proximity provided, the social world, the professional credibility of the position, the specific weight that comes from being known as someone who operates at that level, all of this was gone when the position was gone. These were not trivial losses. They were the infrastructure of a professional life that had been built around the proximity and that did not survive the removal of it in any simple form. He said he did not regret the leaving. He said this with the specific quality of someone who has rehearsed the statement often enough to know it is true, and who says it not to convince the listener but because it is accurate and accuracy matters. He said the regret was for the staying, for the years of the staying and what the staying required, for the conversations in which he had shaped the output of genuine analysis toward the preferred conclusion, for the dissent he had recorded and not insisted upon, for the decisions he had watched being made in the performance of a deliberative process that was not deliberative and had said nothing that actually changed anything. He said the inner circle always knows what it is doing. This is perhaps the most important thing he said. The courtiers are not naive. They are intelligent professionals with direct knowledge of the full picture and direct understanding of what their function inside the system actually is, as opposed to what it is described as being. They know. They make the calculation. They stay or they go. Most of them stay. And the staying enables the continuation of everything that their honest assessment of the situation would tell them should not continue. That is the inner circle. That is its function and its cost and the specific moral weight it carries in the story of how Charles became and remained and is now the king. The inner circle enabled it. The inner circle is still there. It has different names and different faces, but the same function and the same dynamic and the same calculation being made by the same type of person in the same position. And Clarence House is still running, managing the portrait, maintaining the gap, doing what it has always done with the skill and the institutional intelligence of an organization that has been doing it for longer than any of the people currently inside it have been alive. There is a dimension of the Charles story that the standard account, even the critical account, tends to pass through without fully stopping to examine. The women, not Camilla, not Diana, not the women whose names are part of the main narrative and whose experiences have been documented and analyzed and argued over in the public record for decades. The other women, the women whose names are not in the record and will not be in the record. The women who worked in his households as secretaries and housekeepers and ladies-in-waiting and personal assistants, and the various other categories of female domestic and professional service that surrounded him throughout his adult life. These women experienced something specific, something that was its own category within the broader experience of serving Charles, and that requires its own account because the broader account, in absorbing it into the general picture of the household, loses something that matters. What they experienced was a particular kind of invisibility, not the invisibility of the staff generally, though they experienced that too. A gendered invisibility, the specific invisibility of women in service to a man of his generation and formation and position, who had been shaped by institutions and traditions that treated women in professional roles as a specific category of presence, whose function was support and whose personhood was not the primary concern of the person being supported. A former personal secretary described her experience of working for Charles with the specific clarity of someone who has had considerable time to understand what the experience contained and who has decided that the understanding deserves to be said. She said that Charles was not hostile to women in any explicit sense. He was not the type to make the kind of statements that constitute the formal category of workplace hostility. He did not create a working environment that was hostile in the identifiable ways that formal accountability mechanisms address. What he created was something subtler, the working environment of a man for whom women in professional roles were a category of presence whose primary function was to support his operation, and whose independent professional identity was not something the environment was structured to accommodate. She described the specific experience of having a professional judgment dismissed, not loudly, not with the explicit statement that the judgment was being dismissed because it came from her, with the subtler mechanism of the simply not registering, the opinion offered and not received, not challenged, which would at least have acknowledged its existence, not engaged with, which would have required treating it as something worth engaging with, simply passed over, moved past, as if it had not been offered. She said this happened with a consistency that established it as the environment's normal operating register, rather than an isolated incident, and she said that its consistency was what made it most difficult to address, because addressing it required identifying a pattern rather than a specific event, and patterns of the kind she was describing do not produce the kind of concrete accountable incident that formal processes exist to address. She said she watched the same pattern operate differently with the male members of the professional staff, not uniformly, not without variation. There were men whose judgments were also routinely passed over, and women whose contributions were occasionally registered with genuine engagement. But the pattern in the aggregate produced a working environment in which the professional authority of women was a different thing from the professional authority of men, and the difference was felt by every woman in the household, with the accuracy of something directly experienced. A former housekeeper described a different dimension of the same reality, the physical dimension, The daily management of Charles's physical environment that was the primary work of the female domestic staff, and that was, in the experience of the women who performed it, work that was invisible in the specific sense that it disappeared upon completion. A room that was perfectly prepared for his return was a room that simply was as it should be. The labor that had produced the perfect preparation was absent from the reality of the room as he experienced it. He walked into rooms that were ready, and what he experienced was rooms that were ready. The work that created the readiness did not exist in his experience of it. The women who had performed the work did not exist in his experience of the performance. She said this was not unique to Charles. It was the condition of domestic service performed by women for men of his generation and class throughout the arc of British social history. She was not naive about the historical context. She understood that what she was describing was the operation of an ancient pattern rather than a specifically Charles phenomenon. What was specific to Charles, she said, was the totality of it, the degree to which the erasure of the labor and the laborer was complete. In other households she had worked in, there had been moments of acknowledgement, brief, insufficient by any standard of proper recognition, but present. Moments in which the person being served had registered the person doing the serving as a human being with a reality beyond the function being performed. In Charles' household, those moments were rarer, not entirely absent, but rarer in a way that the female domestic staff noticed and discussed in their own conversations with the precision of people who have experienced enough variations of the same dynamic to be able to identify when a particular instance represents an extreme of the range. She said Charles walked through the work of women the way he walked through a well-maintained room, registering that the standard was being met, not registering the people who were meeting it. A former lady-in-waiting described the most formal category of female service that surrounded Charles and the specific way in which the formality of the role both defined the experience and obscured it from outside assessment. Ladies-in-waiting occupy a specific position in the royal household. They are women of appropriate social background, whose function is to attend the principal at formal occasions, to assist with correspondence and social obligations, to be present in the ways that the role requires, and to provide the specifically female social support that royal women have always had, and that royal men receive in the equivalent but differently named form of equerries and private secretaries. The lady-in-waiting's experience of Charles was not the same as the domestic staff's experience. She occupied a higher position in the social hierarchy of the household, and was treated with a corresponding difference in register. She was not invisible in the way the housekeeper was invisible. She was present in the formal sense. Her presence was acknowledged and her function was valued in the specific way that formal court roles are valued. What she described was something different from invisibility, something that required its own name. She said Charles's manner toward the women in his formal circle had a quality that she eventually identified as the manner of a man who had been trained to treat women of a certain kind correctly, and who had learned the correct treatment so thoroughly that the correctness itself had become the extent of the engagement. He was courteous. He used the right forms of address. He acknowledged contributions with the right expressions. He performed the correct register of male aristocratic behavior toward women of appropriate social standing that his upbringing and his education and his position required him to perform. And underneath the performance there was nothing, not hostility, not the specific engaged interest that would have indicated that he was treating her as a person rather than as the occupant of a role. Just the performance. The correct social surface with nothing behind it requiring acknowledgement. She said she spent considerable time in her years in the role trying to determine whether this was something specific to her, or whether it was the environment's general operating register for the women within it. She concluded it was the latter. She observed it operating with too many women in too many contexts to attribute it to something about her specifically. She said the most revealing test was comparison. She compared the quality of Charles's engagement with women in his formal circle against the quality of his engagement with men in equivalent positions. The comparison was not dramatic. It was not the kind of obvious differential that would produce an identifiable incident, but it was consistent and it was cumulative, and it produced in her, over the years of her observation of it, a clear picture of an environment in which women were present in ways that were correct and acknowledged in ways that were appropriate and engaged with in ways that were nonetheless substantively different from how the men around the same table were engaged with. She said the difference was not large in any single instance. She said the difference was total in its accumulation. She said she never raised it. The raising of it was not something the environment provided a mechanism for. You did not raise observations of this kind in that household, in that era, in that position. You observed them, you carried them, you performed your role with the professional competence the role required. You went home, she went home, for years she went home, and she carried what she had observed with the professional discretion that the household required, and the private clarity that direct experience produces, and the specific patience of someone who understood that the conditions for speaking about it did not yet exist, and that waiting for those conditions was what the situation required. The conditions have changed, not completely, not without the continued weight of confidentiality agreements and professional considerations and the calculation of costs that everyone who speaks about these environments makes, but more than they were. The space for these accounts is larger than it was. She is speaking into that space now, as are the others. The housekeeper and the personal secretary and the former lady-in-waiting and the women whose names are not in this account and will not be in any formal record, but whose experience is part of the picture that the formal record has excluded. Their experience is part of what was buried. Not the most dramatic part, not the part that would produce the headlines if it were fully disclosed, but part of the picture, part of the full account of what it was like to inhabit the household of a man who became king. The women who served him knew something that the official portrait required to be invisible. Their labor was invisible in his experience of it. Their professional judgment was present but not registered. Their personhood was acknowledged in the correct forms and not engaged with in the ways that genuine acknowledgement requires. They knew it, they carried it, they are setting it down into the record that the management cannot fully suppress because it lives in people, and people, as has been established, cannot be redacted. There are moments in institutional histories that function as tests, not designed as tests, not constructed with the deliberate intention of revealing what the institution is made of. They arrive as events, as crises, as the kind of sudden external pressure that strips away the managed surface and exposes the structural reality underneath. For the British monarchy, and for Charles specifically, the defining test of the modern era arrived in the early hours of the 31st of August 1997. The test was not the death itself. Deaths of significant figures are tests that institutions have been preparing for across their entire history, and the machinery for managing them has been refined through centuries of practice to a level of operational sophistication that is among the highest achievements of institutional management. The test was the response. What an institution does in the hours and days after a crisis that it did not design reveals what the institution actually is in ways that the managed normal operation never can, because the managed normal operation is exactly that, managed. The crisis strips the management away, and what remains is the structural reality. What the British monarchy's response to Diana's death revealed was a structural reality that the management had been concealing for decades. And what it revealed specifically about Charles was something that his own household staff had been carrying in their internal archives for years, and that the public was about to see directly for the first time. The response was wrong. It was wrong in ways that were immediately felt by millions of people who could not necessarily articulate precisely why it was wrong, but who registered the wrongness with the accuracy of people who had been watching Diana for 16 years, and who understood, in ways that went below conscious analysis, the distance between what the moment required and what the institution was providing. The flag over Buckingham Palace that did not fly at half-mast in the days after Diana's death because the protocol did not provide for a flag over Buckingham Palace in the absence of the monarch, and because the protocol was what was being followed. The protocol was correct by its own terms. The protocol was catastrophically wrong in terms of what the moment required from the institution and what the public needed to see from it. The silence, The royal family at Balmoral, with the children, and the absence from London, and the absence of the public statement in the register that the public needed, and the presence only of the formal communications that the management produced with the professional correctness that the management always produced, and that landed in the specific moment with the specific wrongness of correct language used in a context that required something entirely different from correctness. Charles' specific response in those first days was observed by the people around him with the specific attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something that would be significant. He was not unaffected. This requires saying, because the temptation to produce a portrait of complete coldness in the face of Diana's death is the temptation of the simplified account, and the simplified account is not the honest one. He was affected. The people around him in those hours described something that registered as genuine shock and genuine grief of a specific kind, not the grief of a man who had loved his wife in the way she had needed, but the grief of a man who had been connected to someone for many years in complicated ways, and who was now confronting the absolute finality of that connection in its most sudden and most irrevocable form. But the grief, real as it was, operated within the same architecture that had always contained his emotional responses to external events. It was internalized. It was managed. It was processed through the same mechanism that processed everything, the mechanism of continuation, of schedule maintenance, of the professional forward movement that had been the household's response to difficulty throughout the years of the marriage. The children needed him. This is what the public did not fully see in those days, and what the people around him saw with the directness of people who were present. William and Harry were at Balmoral. They had been told about their mother. They were 12 and 15 years old, and they were at a royal estate in Scotland, and their mother was dead in a tunnel in Paris, and they needed something from the adults around them that went beyond correct and beyond managed and beyond the professional forward movement that the institution was providing. Charles was there, physically. He was present in the building. The accounts of what his presence in those days provided to his sons vary in the ways that accounts always vary when the question being addressed is the quality of emotional presence rather than the fact of physical presence. Some accounts, offered by people who wish to be generous, described a father doing what he could within the limits of his formation and his circumstance. A man who sat with his sons and who provided what he was capable of providing in terms of comfort, and who navigated the impossible terrain of those days with what those accounts characterized as genuine effort. Other accounts, offered by people whose observations were less generous and whose observations the former accounts did not contradict so much as supplement, described something that sounded more like the morning after dynamic, the continuation, the management, the breakfast schedule maintained and the day's structure preserved, and the forward movement that was the household's response to difficulty expressing itself in the specific days when what the household contained was two boys who needed something other than forward movement. The public response that finally came, the broadcast, the flag lowering, the return to London, the acknowledgement that the institution had misread the moment and had been required by the visible pressure of public feeling to correct the misreading, was managed with the professional competence that the palace communications apparatus was capable of when it was finally deployed in the right direction. But the correction was itself the revelation. The institution had required correction. It had been wrong in a way that the public could see and had needed the pressure of that public visibility to produce the response that the moment had required from the beginning. What the correction revealed was the structure that produced the wrong response in the first place. The structure that Charles had been at the center of for the entire arc of his public life. The structure of an institution that managed correctly and responded to management cues and maintained the protocol and produced the formal output, and that was, in the specific moments that required something beyond management, something that the management could not produce, not present in the way that genuine human institutions need to be present. The public felt this. They felt it in the way that people feel structural things when the structure is exposed by a crisis that the structure was not adequate to manage. They felt it as a wrongness that went beyond the specific decisions about flags and statements and the timing of returns to London. They felt it as something about what the institution was and what the man at the center of it was, and whether those things were adequate to what the moment and the era and the fundamental human requirement of the situation required. The feeling did not destroy the institution. The management eventually produced the correct response, and the correct response was received, and the crisis was managed past. This is what management does when it is operating at its upper limit, but the feeling stayed. In the way that feelings about structural things stay when they have been produced by genuine exposure rather than by the managed impressions that normal operation provides. The feeling became part of the public's relationship with the institution and with Charles specifically in ways that the subsequent decades of careful management have addressed and have not resolved. Because the feeling was accurate, the public felt something real. They felt the structure. And the structure was what the staff had been carrying in their internal archives, what the inner circle had been enabling, what the communications professionals had been managing around, what the women in the household had been experiencing as the specific texture of their daily working reality. The structure was visible for a few days in September 1997, visible in the way that only crises make structural things visible, by stripping the management away and leaving the thing that the management had been managing. It was visible, and the people who saw it understood something that the official portrait had been preventing them from understanding. The portrait was not the person, the management was not the reality. The institution that had been presenting itself for decades as something was, when the presentation was stripped away, something else. Charles has been king for several years now. The management is running, the portrait is updated and maintained. The communications professionals are doing what they do with the skill that centuries of institutional practice has refined. And somewhere in the internal archives of the people who served him, the knowledge is still there. The specific, embodied, unrepeatable knowledge of what the rooms actually contained, what the mornings after actually looked like, what was asked for when more coffee was asked for, what was not asked for when it should have been. The knowledge is there, and the burial is not complete. There is a particular kind of wealth that does not look like wealth from the outside. It does not arrive in the forms that ordinary people recognize as wealth, not the visible accumulation of personal fortune, not the ostentatious display of expensive things purchased with money that can be traced to its source, not the obvious enrichment of someone who has taken more than their share in ways that formal accountability might address. It arrives in something more diffuse, more structural, more deeply embedded in the architecture of an arrangement that has been in place for so long that its terms have stopped being examined and have started being assumed. An arrangement that provides to the person at its center a level of material comfort and institutional support and financial insulation from the ordinary consequences of ordinary existence that no honest accounting would describe as anything other than extraordinary privilege maintained through mechanisms that a democratic society would not design from scratch if it were designing from scratch. The Duchy of Cornwall. The name has the quality of something from a history book, something medieval and remote and connected to the present only through the thin thread of hereditary tradition that the British monarchy has always used to justify the continuation of arrangements that its beneficiaries have found extremely convenient and that everyone else has found difficult to examine clearly because examining them clearly requires confronting the full strangeness of what they are. The Duchy of Cornwall is an estate, a very large estate, approximately 135,000 acres of land spread across 23 counties of England, concentrated primarily in Cornwall and the Scilly Isles but extending into other parts of the country in ways that the medieval origins of the arrangement had established and that subsequent centuries of careful management had maintained, and in some cases expanded. The estate generates income. Substantial income. In the years when Charles was Prince of Wales, the income from the duchy was running at figures that increased from approximately £4 million per year in the early years of his tenure to figures that by the later years had exceeded £20 million annually. The income was not taxed in the way that the income of ordinary people or even of very wealthy ordinary people is taxed. Charles paid income tax on it voluntarily, which is a phrase that requires sitting with for a moment. The heir to the throne paid income tax voluntarily on the income from his hereditary estate. The voluntariness of the arrangement is itself a statement about the relationship between the institution and the tax system that governs everyone else. The duchy's income supported Charles's household, his staff, his residences, his various operations, the costs of the private life that ran alongside the public one and that the public funding through the sovereign grant did not fully cover. It supported, in other words, a way of living whose scale and whose specific texture the staff who maintained it experienced daily from the inside. What did that way of living look like from the inside? A former member of the household accounts team, who worked within the financial administration of Charles's household for several years, described the experience of working within the budget structure of an operation of that scale, with the specific precision of someone whose professional function had given them direct access to the numbers. She said the scale was the first thing, the numbers involved in the daily operation of the household, the staffing costs, the maintenance costs for the various residences, the travel arrangements, the catering requirements for the formal entertaining that was a regular feature of the household's operation, the clothing budgets, the horticultural expenditure at Highgrove, which was itself a significant operation, the costs associated with the various charitable and official engagements. All of these numbers accumulated to an annual household operation cost that was, by any ordinary measure, very large. She said the second thing was the unquestioned quality of the expenditure. Not wasteful in any obvious sense, not the spending of someone who was throwing money at unnecessary things for the pleasure of throwing money, but spending at a level and in a register that assumed, at every point, that the standard required was whatever standard Charles had determined the standard should be. And the standard Charles had determined the standard should be was not a standard that had been arrived at through any process of consideration about what was reasonable or proportionate or justifiable in relation to the public and private resources that were funding it. It was the standard of someone who had never been required to consider what was reasonable or proportionate or justifiable, because the resources had always been sufficient to meet whatever standard he required, and no one in his environment had ever found it their role to suggest that the standard might be reconsidered. She described a specific category of expenditure that she found, over the years of her work within the system, most revealing about the nature of the operation she was inside: the personal comforts. The specific, detailed, expensive maintenance of the physical environment of Charles's daily life at the level of detail that the staff who served him had described in their accounts of the requirements. The bath temperature, the arrangement of objects, the preparation of clothing. Each of these requirements, maintained to the standard required, had costs, not large individual costs. The accumulated cost of maintaining a physical environment to a standard of absolute precision across all of its dimensions over the course of a year was a number that the accounts team managed as a line item that was simply part of the operation. She said that what struck her, as someone who managed numbers for a living and who therefore understood what numbers represented in terms of choices and priorities, was not the size of the number. The size of the number was large, but it was within the parameters of what the duchy's income could support and what the household's operation required by its own terms. What struck her was the absence of any process by which the number was questioned, any conversation in which someone asked whether the standard was proportionate, any mechanism by which the costs of maintaining Charles's physical environment to its required specification were weighed against any other consideration whatsoever. The number was what it was because the standard was what it was, and the standard was what it was because Charles required it, and Charles requiring it was sufficient justification for its maintenance, and no further justification was sought or offered or expected. This was the duchy's function at the household level. It was the financial architecture that made the specific texture of Charles's daily life possible. The texture that the valets described in terms of the bath temperature and the toothpaste, and the arrangement of objects. The texture that the inner circle enabled through the management of the decision-making processes that surrounded it. The texture that the communications professionals protected through the management of what the public was permitted to understand about it. The duchy made it financially possible. The household made it operationally possible. The inner circle made it institutionally possible. The communications apparatus made it publicly possible. All of these systems working together produced the specific reality of Charles's daily life and protected it from the scrutiny that would have required it to justify itself in ways it had never been required to justify itself. But the duchy was more than the financial architecture of a personal lifestyle. It was also an economic entity with significant reach into the lives of the people and communities on whose land it operated. The tenants of the duchy. These are the people whose relationship with the institution was not that of staff or courtiers or communications professionals or inner circle members. Their relationship was the relationship of tenants to landlord, a very specific landlord, one whose ownership of the land they farmed or lived on, or operated businesses on, was not the result of any transaction in the contemporary sense but of an arrangement established in the 14th century and maintained through the mechanism of hereditary succession that had never been subject to the kind of democratic accountability that other landlord-tenant relationships were subject to. Former tenants and current tenants who have spoken about their experience of the duchy as a landlord have described something that sits in a complicated space between the positive and the critical. The duchy was, by the accounts of those who dealt with it, a professionally managed estate operation that maintained properties to a generally acceptable standard and that operated within the legal framework governing landlord-tenant relationships. It was also, by those same accounts, an operation that existed within a power relationship that was not ordinary. The tenant of the duchy was not the tenant of an ordinary landlord. The landlord was the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales was the heir to the throne of the country in which the tenant lived. The power differential in that relationship was not something that the professional management of the estate operation dissolved. It was structural. It was present in every interaction, whether or not it was explicitly exercised. A former duchy tenant who farmed land in Cornwall for several years before deciding not to renew his tenancy described the experience of the relationship with the duchy management in terms that were specific and measured and that located the discomfort in the structural reality rather than in any individual interaction. He said the people who managed the duchy on a day-to-day basis were professionals who conducted themselves professionally. He had no complaint against them as individuals or against the specific management decisions they had made in their dealings with him. He said his discomfort was with something beneath the professional management, with the nature of the arrangement itself. He said that farming land owned by the duchy meant farming land whose future was in the hands of an institution that was accountable to him in none of the ways that normal landlord accountability operates. A private landlord could be taken to court. A council landlord could be challenged through democratic processes. The duchy's accountability was to the Crown and to the legal framework governing Crown estates and to the public interest in ways that were defined by the institution itself to a degree that he found, when he thought about it carefully, troubling. He said he thought about it carefully after he had left the tenancy and was no longer in the relationship and was therefore in a position to think about it without the practical constraints that the relationship imposed. He said that inside the relationship the practical constraints were significant. You did not think too carefully about the nature of the arrangement because the arrangement was the foundation on which your farming operation rested, and careful thinking about the nature of the foundation was not something that the practical requirement to operate on the foundation made comfortable. He said this was perhaps the most honest description of what the duchy's power relationship actually looked like for the people inside it. Not explicit pressure. Not the use of the relationship's power in ways that could be identified and challenged. The structural weight of an arrangement that made certain thoughts uncomfortable to think, and certain questions uncomfortable to ask, and certain challenges uncomfortable to make. The structural weight was the duchy's most significant power, not the income it generated or the land it owned or the specific terms of the tenancy agreements it operated. The weight of the arrangement itself. The weight of an institution whose legitimacy rested on centuries of precedent and whose relationship with the people it affected was not mediated by any democratic accountability mechanism that those people could effectively use. Charles benefited from this weight in the specific way that people benefit from structural advantages that they did not design and did not consciously choose, and that function so naturally within the landscape of their experience that they do not experience them as advantages. They experience them as simply how things are. The duchy was simply how things were. The income was simply what the income was. The standard was simply what the standard was. The arrangement was simply the arrangement. And the people who maintained it, who administered it, who managed its accounts and its tenancies and its professional operations, understood from the inside what the people on the outside were not encouraged to examine. That the how things are was a specific choice, made and maintained through specific mechanisms by specific people with specific interests in its continuation. That the simply of it was not simple. That the arrangement was an arrangement. that the weight of it was felt by people who did not have access to the public platforms or the institutional credibility or the communications apparatus that would have allowed them to describe the feeling in ways that could be heard at the scale at which the institution operated. The money was part of the buried thing, not the most dramatic part, not the part that produced the rages or the treatment of Diana or the constitutional overreach, but part of the structural foundation on which all of those things rested. The money made the specific texture of Charles's daily life possible, the texture that required the bath to be the correct temperature and the toothpaste to be applied in the correct quantity and the objects on the desk to be arranged in the correct configuration, and the people who failed to maintain these specifications to be addressed with the focused, cold attention of someone for whom the maintenance of his physical environment was not a luxury but a baseline. The money made the baseline possible. And the money came from an arrangement that was not examined with the clarity that democratic accountability would have required, because the institution that benefited from it had the resources and the sophistication to ensure that the examination remained, in the ways that mattered most, incomplete. Charitable work is the armor of the powerful. This is not a cynical statement. It is an observation about how charitable engagement functions in the social economy of people whose position requires public legitimacy and whose private behavior generates material that would damage that legitimacy if it were fully visible. Charitable work is real. The good it does is real. The impact on the lives of people who benefit from it is genuine and significant and not reducible to the political function it also serves. But it also serves a political function, in the specific sense that it produces in the public mind an image that sits in a particular relationship with the private reality and that the private reality requires in order to remain viable. Charles's charitable work was genuine. This requires saying with the same clarity with which the complicated dimensions of it require saying. The Prince's Trust, established in 1976 with a personal investment of £600 from his naval severance pay, grew into one of the most significant youth charities in Britain. It provided grants and mentoring and vocational training to hundreds of thousands of young people who were not in education or employment or training, and who found in the Trust's support a practical intervention in circumstances that would otherwise have produced much worse outcomes. The people the Trust served were real. The outcomes it produced in their lives were real. The staff who worked within the Trust's operations across its decades of growth were genuine professionals doing genuine work with genuine commitment to the mission. None of this was manufactured. None of it was hollow. And simultaneously the Trust served Charles's public image in ways that the communications professionals who managed that image understood clearly and managed deliberately. The former senior figure in the charity sector who worked in proximity to the Prince's Trust operation during a significant period of its development described the dual reality of the operation with the specific frankness of someone who has thought carefully about how to be honest about something complicated. She said that the Trust's charitable work was real and effective and deserving of the credit it received. She said this was not in question and was not something she wanted to complicate unnecessarily. She said that alongside the charitable operation there was a communications operation, a professional, sophisticated, well-resourced communications operation whose function was to ensure that the charitable work was visible in ways and at times and through channels that served the management of Charles's public image. That the Trust's activities were surfaced for public attention, not simply according to the logic of what the charity was doing and what its beneficiaries needed, but according to the logic of what the palace communications apparatus needed in terms of the timing and the register of positive coverage. She said the two operations were not always in conflict. Often they aligned naturally. The charity did things that were genuinely newsworthy and the communications apparatus surfaced them, and the coverage served both the charity's profile and Charles's image simultaneously without requiring any compromise of either. But she said there were times when they were in tension, times when the communications logic required the charity to be surfaced in ways or at moments that the charity's own operational logic would not have chosen. Times when the timing of a public engagement with the Trust's work was determined not by what was happening inside the Trust, but by what was happening in Charles's public image and what the image required. She said those times were managed with the sophistication of an operation that understood the dual function it was serving and that had developed, through years of practice, the skill of making the communications logic invisible within the charitable logic so that the surfacing appeared to be driven entirely by the charity's work rather than by the image management that was also driving it. She said this was not unique to Charles or to the Prince's Trust. She said it was the normal operation of charitable engagement by powerful public figures across the entire landscape of such engagement. She said she had worked with enough operations of this kind to understand that what she was describing at the Prince's Trust was an example of a general practice rather than a specific corruption. She said this as a qualification and not as an excuse, because the general practice, however normal, was still a practice that used charitable engagement and the genuine good it produced as partial cover for the management of reputational material that would otherwise have required direct engagement with the public record. The direct engagement with the public record was what the charitable operation helped to prevent being necessary. Not completely, not as the primary mechanism of the management which had many other tools, but as one significant mechanism among several. One that had the specific advantage of being resistant to criticism, because criticizing someone's charitable work required treating the work's genuine good as less significant than its political function, and most people reasonably found that treatment uncomfortable. So the charitable work was not criticized, or was criticized only at the margins and in ways that the communications apparatus could absorb without significant damage to the portrait. And the portrait was maintained in part through the genuine good that the charities did, and in part through the management of how that genuine good was surfaced, and when and in what relationship to the private material that the portrait was managing around. The people who benefited from the Prince's Trust had no knowledge of this dual function. Their benefit was real and was not compromised by the political purpose it also served, but the political purpose was real too. And the people who operated within the communications dimension of the charitable operation understood both realities with the professional clarity of people whose job required them to hold both. They held both, they served both, they produced the output that both required, and they maintained, in the careful professional silence of people who understood what they were part of, the separation between the two realities that the public portrait required. The separation is less complete than it was. The conditions for examining it are more available than they were. The account of the dual function is part of what is being assembled from the fragments that the management could slow but not permanently suppress. The charities were real, the good was real, the political function was also real, and the management of how these realities related to each other was part of the operation that produced the official Charles and that buried the private one. There is a specific quality to the conviction of someone who has been told their entire life that their judgment is sound. It is different from the conviction of someone who has developed their views through the normal process of encounter with evidence and argument and the natural revision that the encounter produces. It is more total, more impervious to counter-evidence, more certain of itself in a way that goes beneath conscious consideration and operates at the level of basic assumption about how the world works and whose assessments of it can be trusted. Charles's conviction about architecture, about farming, about homeopathic medicine, about the various subjects on which he had decided he had something important to say and had proceeded to say it with the resources and the platform and the institutional weight that his position made available. These convictions had the specific quality of someone for whom the conviction was not the end point of a reasoning process but the starting point of a campaign. The architecture campaign is the most extensively documented example of this quality in action. Charles hated modern architecture, not in the way that many people have aesthetic preferences that lead them to prefer some things over others while understanding that the preferences are personal and that the world is not obligated to organize itself around them. He hated it in the way that someone hates something when they have decided that the hating is not merely an aesthetic response but a moral judgment, that the things they hate are not merely things they find unattractive but things that are genuinely wrong and that their wrongness gives the person who has identified it the right and the responsibility to act against them. The Hampton Court speech of 1984 is the formal beginning of the public record of Charles's architectural interventions. He described a planned extension to the National Gallery as a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend. The phrase was vivid and it was widely reported, and it landed with considerable impact because it expressed, in language that was not the careful diplomatic language of royal public statements, a direct and specific aesthetic judgment delivered by the heir to the throne about a building that was in the process of being officially approved. The impact of the speech on the project was direct. The winning architects withdrew. The design that had been selected through a competitive, professional process involving significant expertise and considerable public resource was abandoned because the heir to the throne had described it in a phrase that became immediately famous and that no client and no institution could comfortably proceed past. This was the mechanism. The speech was not lobbying in the formal constitutional sense. It was not a letter to a minister. It was a public statement made on a public occasion about a professional competition that had been conducted by professionals with the appropriate authority and expertise and that had reached a conclusion through appropriate processes. The conclusion was overturned by a phrase, by the application of the heir to the throne's personal aesthetic judgment delivered through a platform that no other person in the country possessed, and that the professionals whose work had been described as a monstrous carbuncle had no equivalent platform from which to answer. The architects whose work was described in those terms had no recourse, not legal recourse, because Charles had not done anything that the law provided recourse against, not professional recourse because the professional bodies that might have addressed the imbalance did not have the institutional weight to do so against the heir to the throne, not reputational recourse because the phrase had entered the culture and was going to remain in the culture, and the people whose work it described were going to carry the description without any mechanism for challenging it at the scale at which it had been delivered. Charles moved on to the next project, the next building he found inadequate, the next intervention in a professional domain that he had decided his judgment equipped him to enter regardless of the formal systems of expertise and accountability that governed the domain for everyone else. The Poundbury project in Dorset, the model village, the attempt to construct in physical form the architectural principles that Charles had been advocating through speeches and letters and interventions in planning processes. Poundbury was built on Duchy of Cornwall land, which meant that Charles had direct control over what was built there in ways that he did not have over the broader built environment, and that allowed him to produce something that was, by his own assessment, the alternative to the things he had been criticizing. The architectural and planning profession's assessments of Poundbury have been varied and have included serious positive engagements with what the project attempted alongside serious critical assessments of what it achieved. This is the normal process of professional evaluation, and the range of the assessments is itself evidence that the questions the project engaged with were real questions worth engaging with. What was not a normal process was the mechanism by which Poundbury came into being and the power relationship within which it operated. It was built on land owned by Charles. The tenants who lived there and the businesses that operated there were tenants and leaseholders of the duchy. The planning principles that governed it were principles that Charles had determined should govern it. The oversight of whether those principles were being realized was conducted by people who reported to the duchy. It was not a demonstration of an idea tested against the normal constraints and competitive pressures that built environment projects normally operate within. It was a demonstration of an idea implemented by someone with the resources and the land ownership and the institutional position to implement it without those constraints. What it proved about the idea was therefore limited by the specificity of the conditions under which the proof was conducted. The homeopathy dimension of Charles's campaign activities is perhaps the most revealing illustration of the conviction quality, because homeopathy is not a matter of aesthetic preference in the way that architecture can be characterized as such. It is a matter of evidence, of what the scientific and medical research record shows about the efficacy of a treatment modality and what it does not show. What the research record shows is not supportive of homeopathy's claims. This is not a controversial characterization. It is the conclusion of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that constitute the highest level of evidence available in medical research, and it has been the conclusion of those reviews conducted across multiple countries and research traditions consistently enough to constitute a scientific consensus. Charles disagreed. Not in the way that someone disagrees with a scientific consensus when they have engaged with the evidence and found it unpersuasive for specific reasons they can articulate. In the way that someone disagrees with a scientific consensus when the consensus conflicts with something they believe and the belief is more deeply rooted than the consensus is capable of reaching. He wrote letters to the Chief Medical Officer, to the Department of Health, to the heads of NHS trusts, advocating for the inclusion of homeopathic treatments in the services available to NHS patients, advocating against the decisions of NHS bodies that had concluded on the basis of the evidence that homeopathic treatments should not receive public funding. The people who received these letters were in the position that all recipients of Charles's letters were in, a position with no good options, agreeing with the heir to the throne's advocacy of treatments that the evidence did not support would have been scientifically indefensible. Disagreeing clearly and on the basis of the evidence would have required telling the heir to the throne that his judgment on a matter he had strong views about was wrong. Most of them found the middle path that the middle path always offers to people in impossible positions: acknowledgement without agreement, engagement without concession. The careful professional language of people who are managing a relationship that has no good options by choosing the option that maintains the relationship while not fully conceding the point. The scientists and medical professionals who were asked publicly about Charles's homeopathy advocacy described the situation with varying degrees of directness depending on their own institutional positions and what those positions permitted them to say. The ones with the least to risk institutionally were the most direct. They said what the evidence showed. They said what Charles's advocacy in contradiction of the evidence represented. They said it in the careful language of scientific discourse, and they said it in ways that were clear enough that the picture required no further elaboration. Charles continued. The letters continued. The advocacy continued. The conviction was not addressed by the evidence because the conviction was not formed by the evidence and was not therefore susceptible to being revised by it. This is the specific quality of the conviction of someone who has been told their entire life that their judgment is sound. It operates independently of the normal processes by which judgments are tested and revised. It is not stupid. It is not without genuine content. It is simply inaccessible to the mechanisms that normally produce revision in human judgment. And the inner circle that surrounded it enabled it with the same mechanism that enabled everything else. The validation, the shaping of the output of genuine analysis toward the preferred conclusion. The management of the environment around the conviction so that the evidence that challenged it arrived in forms and through channels that reduced its capacity to produce the friction that revision requires. The conviction survived because the environment was managed to ensure its survival, and the environment was managed because the management of the environment was what proximity to Charles required of the people who chose to remain in that proximity. The architects whose work was described as monstrous carbuncles, and the scientists whose evidence was overridden by conviction, and the planning professionals whose expertise was bypassed by a speech all experienced the specific reality of operating in the same space as someone whose institutional position gave his personal judgment the force of something more than personal judgment. They experienced it without recourse, without the platform or the institutional weight or the communications apparatus that would have allowed them to respond at the scale at which the judgment had been delivered. They went home, they carried what they carried. They came back the next day and continued in their professions with the specific adjustment that direct encounter with unaccountable power always requires of the people who encounter it. They adjusted, they continued, they said what they could say in the spaces where it was safe to say it, and they held the rest in the internal archive that this kind of experience always produces. The archive is there, still, in the memories of the professionals whose work was overridden and whose expertise was bypassed and who had no recourse against the specific mechanism of unaccountable institutional power expressing itself through the conviction of a man who had been told his entire life that his judgment was sound. Their experience is part of the buried thing, part of the picture that the official portrait required to remain invisible, part of what the management was managing around. The shape is assembling, from their accounts, and from the staff accounts, and from the inner circle accounts, and from the women's accounts, and from the duchy accounts, and from the charitable operation accounts. The shape of a man and an institution and the gap between what both of them presented and what the people inside them actually experienced. Still assembling, still becoming visible. The burial is not complete. There is a particular moment in the life of every buried truth when the burial stops being sustainable. Not a dramatic moment, not the moment of a single revelation that cracks the official portrait open in one clean break and exposes everything underneath it simultaneously. History does not work that way, and institutions of this kind do not fall that way, and the people who have been carrying the buried thing do not release it in a single coordinated act of disclosure that produces the comprehensive reckoning that the truth deserves. It happens the other way, slowly, in fragments, in the accumulation of small releases that individually seem insufficient and that collectively over time, over years and sometimes over decades, assemble into something that the management cannot absorb as it absorbed the individual pieces. Something that has reached the scale at which it stops being manageable and starts being the record. The record of Charles is at that point now, not because of any single account, not because of this one, not because of Harry's memoir or the Sussex documentary or the fragments of staff testimony that have emerged across the years, or the Black Spider memos or the architectural speeches or any individual piece of the picture. Because of the accumulation, because the pieces have been assembling for long enough and have reached a mass that the management is no longer fully adequate to contain, because the conditions have changed in ways that make the containing harder than it was. Because the people who carried the buried thing are reaching the point where the carrying has gone on long enough. Because truth, as has been said in this account and deserves to be said again at its end, is patient in ways that management is not. The reckoning is not complete. It will not be complete in the lifetimes of most of the people who experienced what this account has described. The institution will continue. The management will continue. The official portrait will be maintained and updated and defended with the professional intelligence of an organization that has been doing it for longer than any of the people currently inside it have been alive. But the reckoning has begun, in the way that reckonings begin when the conditions for them have finally arrived, not with a verdict, with a question, with the specific serious form of the question that the management had been preventing from being asked. What actually happened in those rooms? The question is being asked now, with sufficient seriousness, by sufficient numbers of people, in sufficient public spaces that the management cannot close all of them simultaneously. And the answer is assembling, from the fragments, from the testimony, from the people who were there and who carried what they saw with the professional silence that the institution required, and who are, slowly and carefully and at the pace that changed conditions permit, setting down what they carried. This account is part of the answer, not the whole answer, not the complete record, but part of it, the part that could be assembled from the sources available, from the fragments that the management could slow but not stop, from the shape that becomes visible when you assemble enough pieces that the outline of the thing they describe becomes unmistakable. The shape of a man, formed by a system that was designed to produce him and that succeeded in producing exactly what it was designed to produce, capable of genuine qualities that the system also produced and that deserve acknowledgement in any honest account, and shaped at the level of basic assumption and basic behavior into patterns that the people around him experienced at considerable personal cost, and that the institution spent considerable professional resource ensuring the world would not see clearly. The shape of an institution, ancient and sophisticated and genuinely capable of things that simpler analyses do not give it credit for, and also the product of centuries of practice at managing the gap between what it presents and what it is. A gap that the accumulation of the buried things has been steadily widening until the management of it requires more resource than the management can sustain indefinitely. The shape of the people in the rooms, the valets and the butlers and the housekeepers and the ladies-in-waiting and the personal secretaries and the correspondence staff and the inner circle members and the communications professionals and the architects and the farmers and the scientists and the women whose professional judgments were not registered and the tenants of the duchy and the charitable workers who served the dual function and all of the others whose experience of proximity to the center produced in them the specific knowledge that proximity always produces and that the institution always buries. They are the most important part of the shape because they are the people whose experience the official portrait required to be invisible, whose knowledge was the thing being managed, whose testimony is the foundation on which any honest account of what happened in those rooms must be built. They knew, they carried what they knew with the professional silence that the institution required, and the private clarity that direct experience produces, and the specific patience of people who understood that the conditions for speaking about it were not yet available, and that waiting was what the situation required. Some of them are no longer waiting. When an institution asks people to carry something in silence, It is making a specific transaction. It is saying, your experience of this, your knowledge of what happened in these rooms, your witness to the gap between the official version and the reality you lived inside, all of this has value to us in the specific form of its absence from the public record. We need it to be absent. We need it to remain inside you rather than entering the world where it would complicate the portrait we are maintaining. And in exchange for this service, for the carrying of this thing in silence for as long as we need you to carry it, we offer you the continuation of your position within the institution and the professional standing that the position provides and the specific satisfactions of working in proximity to something of historical significance and the pension that the years of service accumulate toward. This is the transaction. It is never stated in those terms. It does not need to be stated in those terms because the terms are understood by everyone inside the institution with the clarity of people who have direct experience of what happens when the transaction is declined. When someone decides that what they are carrying is more important than the continuation of the position and says it and loses the position as a direct consequence, the people who accepted the transaction paid a price that the transaction did not name, the price of carrying, of the specific fatigue that sustained double consciousness produces, of going home in the evenings with what they knew and managing it privately, and coming back in the mornings and performing the professional silence again, of the accumulation of that performance across years and in some cases decades of service, of what that accumulation did to them as people, to their relationships outside the institution, to their sense of themselves, to the particular internal cost of being a witness to things that you know matter and that you are professionally prevented from saying matter in the ways and the spaces where the mattering could produce any consequence. Some of them found the cost manageable, found the satisfactions of the work and the position and the professional identity sufficient to absorb what the carrying required, found ways to compartmentalize that allowed the professional and the private to coexist without the coexistence becoming unsustainable. Some of them did not find it manageable, left earlier than they had planned, not dramatically, in the quiet way of people who have reached the limit of what a specific environment can ask of them, who have done the calculation and found that what the institution was offering in exchange for the carrying was no longer sufficient to cover the cost of the carrying. They left. They signed the agreements. They entered their subsequent lives carrying what the agreements covered the expression of but could not reach in its private reality, and they found that the leaving did not resolve the carrying, that the carrying continued after the leaving in ways they had not fully anticipated, that the knowledge of what they had witnessed stayed specific and embodied and present in the way that direct experience always stays present regardless of what formal distance from it the passage of time provides. This is the specific inheritance of the people who served in those households, and who saw what they saw, and who carried what they carried, not the financial inheritance of the institution they served, not the social inheritance of the connections that palace service produced, the specific inheritance of what they know, what they witnessed, what they are carrying still. The inheritance is real, it has weight. It is present in them daily in ways that the people who have not carried anything like it find difficult to fully understand, and that the people who have carried something like it recognize immediately and completely. A former member of the household staff who had served across several years and across more than one royal residence described what the carrying felt like years after the leaving. She said it felt like knowing the answer to a question that nobody was asking in the form that would allow the answer to be given, that the knowledge was available and specific and ready to be said, and that the conditions for saying it in ways that would enter the record and be heard at the scale at which it needed to be heard had not been available for most of the years since she had left. She said she had spent years in a specific kind of waiting, not passive waiting, the active waiting of someone who understands that the conditions will change eventually because conditions always change, and that the patience required is real patience, not the patience of someone who has given up, but the patience of someone who has decided that what they know deserves to be said, and that the saying requires conditions that are not yet fully available but that are more available than they were, and that are moving in a direction that will eventually make the saying possible in the form it deserves. She said the conditions were moving. She said she could feel the movement in the way that you feel the direction of change before the change has fully arrived, in the way that the air changes before the weather changes. in the way that things that have been building for a long time start to show their direction before they produce their outcome. She said she was ready, had been ready for a long time, was waiting for the form that would allow what she knew to enter the record in a way that served the record rather than merely served the person saying it. This account is part of that form, part of the conditions she was waiting for, part of the slowly assembling landscape of public reckoning with what happened in those rooms that the management had been preventing from being assembled, and that is now being assembled despite the management because the management is encountering its limits and the limits are being reached. The carrying is being set down, not all at once, not by everyone simultaneously, in the fragments and the careful accounts and the hedged and qualified and legally cautious testimony of people who understand what they are doing and who have decided to do it because the truth deserves its place in the record, and the people whose experience the truth describes deserve to have that experience acknowledged. This is what remains, after the rages and the coldness and the constitutional letters and the treatment of Diana and the inner circle's enabling and the communications apparatus's management and the duchy's architecture and the charitable operations dual function and the women's specific invisibility and the architects' and farmers' and scientists' encounters with unaccountable conviction. After all of it, what remains is the truth, specific and embodied and carried by the people who were there, still being carried, being set down slowly into the record that the management cannot fully suppress because it lives in people, and people cannot be redacted. The record is being built, the shape is assembling, the burial is not complete, and the people who carried the buried thing deserve to have the carrying acknowledged by anyone who receives what their carrying has produced. Thanks for watching the full documentary. If you like this type of documentary, then please stay with us by subscribing to our channel.